Hi guys, and welcome to Anunnaki Sanctuary's channel. Tonight, we drift down into the low, wide-breathing space between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where the air is warm even after sunset and the ground holds the day's heat like a sleepy animal. You are standing on river mud that has been pressed flat by centuries of bare feet, sandals, cartwheels, and the occasional ceremonial procession where everyone pretends they are not sweating. Somewhere nearby, a reed bed shivers with insects, and the water makes that soft, repetitive sound that is basically ancient white noise. If you listen closely, it almost feels like the rivers are talking. Just remember, you probably won't survive this. Not because of monsters, but because you would absolutely drink unfiltered river water on day one and then complain about it like it was a surprise. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments, because I love imagining this story traveling across your night. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin by noticing something simple and almost boring, which is exactly how the best history starts. In Mesopotamia, floods are not rare miracles. They are part of the calendar. They are the rivers doing what rivers do when the mountains far away decide to melt their snow. And when rain chooses violence upstream while everyone downstream is trying to harvest barley like they have deadlines. You stand on a levee, a low ridge of packed earth, and you can picture the water rising. Not in a cinematic wall, just in a stubborn, patient creep that takes a field one day, a courtyard the next, and then politely enters your house like it pays rent. This is the quiet background hum beneath the flood stories. Before any hero builds a boat, before any god regrets anything, you have ordinary people who already know what wet disaster smells like. The scent is mud, rot, and reeds, plus the sharp tang of bitumen that people smear on the baskets and walls to keep water out. You can almost taste it, that mineral heaviness in the air. And this is where the comparison begins, without drama, because the earliest versions are not trying to outscare each other. They are trying to explain, to organize, to make the chaos of water into sentences you can recite. You step into a scribal school, which is less like Hogwarts and more like a place where young people learn to suffer politely. The room is dim. The walls are sun-baked brick. A teacher sits with the calm authority of someone who has seen too many students carve a sign backwards. You watch as a student presses a reed stylus into wet clay, making wedge-shaped marks that look like tiny bird tracks. This is one mainstream historical fact you can hold on to. Mesopotamians wrote on clay tablets using cuneiform, and scribes trained through long exercises, copying lists, proverbs, and literary passages. The flood story, like many famous works, survives because someone thought it was worth copying, over and over, with aching wrists and a mild sense of doom about exams. And here is the funny part. In a gentle way, you realize that ancient literature is not born in a single perfect moment. It is born in copies. It is born in the annoying smudge a student makes, and the teacher's sigh, and the correction pressed into the clay like a tiny scolding. So when you say, the flood story, you're really saying, a family of flood stories, each one related, each one slightly different, like cousins at a reunion who all insist they remember the same event, but somehow disagree about what time dinner was. You wander through time as if it is a street market. On one stall, you see a Sumerian version, where the flood hero is usually called Ziusudra. On another stall, you see an Akkadian version, where the hero is Atrahasis in one telling and Utnapishtim in another. You do not grab any one version and declare it the winner. Tonight, you're doing something calmer. You're comparing them like someone comparing recipes, not to judge, but to notice the shared ingredients and the little personal twists. You lean closer to the clay and notice how the earliest Sumerian evidence is fragmentary. Pieces of a story survive in shards, like a broken bowl that still smells faintly of soup. That's the reality check of ancient history. You rarely get the full book. You get scraps. You get a line about a storm, half a sentence about a boat, and then a break in the tablet where time just shrugs. And yet, those scraps are enough to show that a flood narrative existed early, circulating in Sumerian tradition, and that later Akkadian compositions drew on similar patterns. Now you take a slow breath and let the room widen. The flood is not just a story about water. It is a story about order. Mesopotamian cities depend on controlled water. Canals are life. Irrigation ditches are basically the internet of the ancient world. Except instead of memes, you get barley. When water behaves, civilization thrives. When water misbehaves, it erases boundaries, property lines, grain stores, and sometimes entire neighborhoods. So when a story says, "The flood came," it is not only describing a disaster, it is describing the collapse of the system that keeps the world predictable. This is where the first quiet comparison begins. Across Mesopotamian flood stories, you often find a divine decision, a chosen survivor, a boat or vessel, the preservation of life, the release of birds, and a post-flood moment where the survivor offers something to the gods. These are recurring motifs. They are like musical themes that keep returning in different songs. The differences are where the cultures show their personalities and where scribes, kings, and temples leave fingerprints. You stroll outside the scribal school in your imagination and the night air feels cooler. You see the ziggurat rising in the distance, a stepped mountain of brick with a temple at the top. Because Mesopotamians love building artificial mountains in a flat land, you can almost hear the faint clink of a priest's jewelry as someone performs a small offering. This matters because flood stories are not just entertainment. They are woven into temple culture, royal ideology, and the idea that the gods can reorder the world whenever they feel like it. Comforting, right? And then, because we promised calm, you do not panic. You simply observe that the gods in these stories can be inconsistent. They can be annoyed, sentimental, bureaucratic, or regretful. Sometimes all within the same narrative. Historians still argue whether these inconsistencies are deliberate theological complexity, the result of combining older traditions, or simply the natural messiness of oral stories turned into written literature by different hands. You let that debate sit there like a lamp on low brightness. It does not need to glare. It just needs to be present. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, you can't help noticing how modern people sometimes talk about these flood stories like they are secret coded messages from a lost, high-tech civilization, or a literal global ocean event that covered everything, everywhere, all at once. It is a popular vibe, the ancients knew something vibe. And it is entertaining in the way a late-night documentary with dramatic music is entertaining. But you are standing here with clay under your fingernails, and you are reminded that Mesopotamia has very real rivers that flood, very real cities built on alluvial plains, and very real reasons to imagine a world reset by water. The fringe idea is that every flood story must point to one single cataclysmic event, like a universal reboot. The calmer observation is that different communities can experience different major floods and still share storytelling patterns. especially in a region connected by a trade, language contact, and imperial politics. You turn back to the tablets. One of the calmest things you can do is admit you are not reading a newspaper report. You are reading literature. Even when these stories include practical measurements or technical details, they are shaped to teach, to warn, to comfort, and to explain the relationship between humans and divine power. A flood in literature is a pressure test. What survives? Who deserves survival? What does the survivor owe afterward? In a world where life depends on grain yields and canal maintenance, the idea of total watery loss is not abstract. It is personal, and that is why the story keeps being copied. You imagine yourself as a city official, which is hilarious because you can barely keep your phone charged. But go with it. You are responsible for maintaining a canal. You know that one breach can cause weeks of chaos. Now scale that up. The flood story becomes the ultimate breach, the ultimate failure of human management. It makes the gods look like the only true engineers, which is a bit rude, honestly. But ancient theology is not here to protect your feelings. In this first section, you are not yet climbing into any boat. You are setting the stage. You are learning to see the flood stories as a network rather than a single line. You are noticing that Sumerian and Akkadian traditions overlap, that later epics incorporate older motifs, and that the same core pattern can be used to express different anxieties. In one telling, the gods are irritated by human noise. In another, the divine council is split, with some gods pushing destruction and others quietly helping the human. In another, the flood becomes a moment of moral reflection, where regret and restraint appear. You let those possibilities float nearby like lanterns on a dark river. You also notice something almost tender. These stories, even when they contain divine wrath, often keep returning to human persistence. Someone listens, someone builds, someone remembers to bring animals, seeds, crafts, and the tiny pieces of civilization that make life more than survival. There is a quiet respect for preparation. If Mesopotamia had a motivational poster, it would probably say, "Water is coming. Seal your basket." You take one more slow look at the scribal school as the students press their styluses into clay. The teacher corrects a sign. Someone mutters under their breath, the ancient equivalent of, "I hate this class." You smile, because it makes the past feel less like a marble statue and more like a living place. The flood story is not distant thunder. It is a shared memory shaped into narrative, carried across languages and centuries by people who wanted the world to make sense, even if only in a story. And as you step forward into the next stretch of riverbank, you feel the first current of the Sumerian version tugging gently at your ankles. Not dragging you, just inviting you to walk alongside Zeusudra, where the survival is steady, ritual-like, and surprisingly quiet. You keep walking as if the river is a hallway and the night is a ceiling, and without any loud announcement, the Sumerian telling slides into view, calm as a candle flame that refuses to flicker. The land around you is flat and patient, stitched with canals and footpaths. And you can feel how everything here depends on rhythm, planting, flooding, draining, harvesting, and then doing it all again because apparently humans love repeating hard chores for thousands of years. In the Sumerian world, the flood is not introduced like a shock twist. It sits in the background like weather that might turn on you. You can almost hear someone mutter, "Not again," the way you do when your phone updates right when you need it. You meet the name Zeusudra like you meet a person in a small town. Everyone seems to know him, not as a superhero, but as a king and a priestly figure who does the right rituals and pays attention. That's already one of the tonal differences you're noticing in this calm comparison. In some later versions, the flood hero is a builder and a survivor, and a man with secret instructions. Here, you feel him as a caretaker of sacred order, someone whose job is to listen properly. It is sleepy, ceremonial, and honestly kind of relatable because half of adulthood is just listening carefully to warnings you would rather ignore. You stand near a temple, and the air smells like incense and damp brick. Inside, there's that hush you get in places where people believe the ceiling is closer to the gods than the street is. You imagine Ziusudra moving through this space, not rushing, not panicking, doing things in the correct sequence. This is your mainstream historical fact for this section in Sumerian city-states. Kingship and temple institutions are tightly intertwined, with priestly roles and royal authority often linked, and rituals and offerings structured daily life. When a flood story centers a king who is also deeply ritual-minded, it reflects a world where legitimacy comes from being aligned with divine order, not from being the loudest guy in the room. The story's calmness is almost sneaky. You feel the divine decision before you see it. There's talk of a council of gods, the kind of meeting that would make you roll your eyes if it happened at work. Except in this case, their agenda item is wipe out humanity. So you try to be respectful. The Sumerian fragments we have are incomplete, like a song where the chorus survives, but some verses are missing. Yet the shape is still recognizable. You sense a plan forming among the gods, and you sense that Ziusudra is not supposed to know. But of course, in stories like this, someone always knows. Either a god slips, or a wall hears, or a whisper travels. Because divine secrecy is apparently very hard to maintain, even with cosmic power. You picture Ziusudra receiving a warning in that strange ancient way where the gods do not always speak plainly. Sometimes it's a dream. Sometimes it's a message delivered through a sacred boundary. Sometimes it's a god talking to a wall, so technically they are not talking to you, which is the oldest loophole in literature. You can almost see him kneeling, listening to what is not being said, gathering meaning from the edges. You might chuckle because it is like when someone in your family says, "I'm not telling you what to do," and then immediately tells you exactly what to do. Divine communication. But make it passive-aggressive. Now the flood itself approaches, and the tone stays measured. No fireworks. No slow-motion screaming extras. Just the sense of inevitability. Ziusudra prepares. There is a boat. Yes, because the story needs a container for survival. But the emphasis in this Sumerian frame feels less like engineering and more like obedience. You can practically feel the clay tablet's moral weight. If you listen, if you honor the gods, if you perform the right acts, you might be preserved. It is not a guarantee for everyone, just a pathway for one man chosen to carry continuity. And continuity matters. This is the first place where your calm comparison gets interesting. Across the Mesopotamian flood traditions, the survivor is not simply escaping death. The survivor is carrying the seed of order into the next world. In Sumerian thinking, order is not just laws and rules. It is the way the cosmos is arranged. It is the right relationship between humans and gods, city and field, king and temple. So when Ziusudra survives, the story hints that the flood is a reset, but not an erase. The goal is not to end everything forever. The goal is to reframe it, to prune it, to start again with a proper alignment. You could almost call it divine housekeeping. Except that metaphor makes it sound like the gods are just tidying shelves. And in reality, they are drowning the shelves, the house, and the neighborhood. So maybe let's not. You move with Ziusudra into the boat's shelter, and the world outside becomes water and wind. The storm in the way these stories describe it. is less like a single moment and more like an endurance test. Days pass. The boat is rocked. The sky's a lid that won't lift, if you're expecting a dramatic montage. The Sumerian tone denies you. It is not interested in spectacle. It is interested in the fact that survival is slow. You wait, you listen, you keep the small rituals of life going. You ration. You sit in damp air and pretend your back does not hurt. Ancient survival, brought to you by terrible posture and stubborn hope. Here comes your open, scholarly debate phrase, naturally woven into the drift. Historians still argue whether the Sumerian Ziusudra story we can reconstruct represents the direct ancestor of the later Akkadian flood accounts, or whether it is one branch of a wider pool of shared traditions that evolved in parallel across languages and cities. You can feel how tempting it is to line everything up neatly, like version A becomes version B becomes version C, because your brain loves a straight line. But Mesopotamia is a braided river. Stories flow, split, merge, pick up new sediment, and sometimes cut a new channel entirely. When the waters finally ease, the story shifts into a quieter kind of proof. In some later versions, you will see birds sent out to test for land, a practical little experiment that feels almost modern. In the Sumerian fragments, the details are less fully preserved, but you still sense the transition from chaos to groundedness. The boat comes to rest. The air changes. You can smell land again, that dusty scent that feels like relief. There is the moment where Ziusudra steps out into the aftermath, and it is not triumphant. It is solemn. Then comes one of the most consistent motifs across Mesopotamian flood stories. The offering. Ziusudra offers sacrifice to the gods. This is not just gratitude, it is a rebinding of relationship. The world has been broken and remade, and now the cords between human and divine must be tied again. There's a kind of deep logic here. If the flood was caused by divine will, then survival without renewed relationship is unstable. You do not just walk away from the gods like, cool, thanks, see ya. You acknowledge, you bargain, you restore balance. Ancient theology is basically a long-term relationship with very high stakes and a lot of gift-giving. Now the quirky tidbit slides in, soft and strange. Some later interpretations, ancient and modern, love the idea that the flood survivor is granted a kind of special status that separates him from ordinary humans, sometimes even immortality, sometimes a distant paradise. With Ziusudra, you can feel that seed already present. The survivor is not just any man. He becomes a boundary figure, half in the human world and half in the divine sphere, the way certain heroes in myth become too important to remain fully ordinary. It is the ancient version of being promoted into management, except instead of meetings you get eternal life somewhere far away, which honestly might be better. Depending on the meeting, you imagine the gods responding. In the Sumerian telling, the mood is not only wrath. There is recognition. There is a kind of quiet granting. Ziusudra's survival is validated by divine acknowledgement, and he is blessed. The story does not need to show you a rainbow or a dramatic vow. It suggests instead that order will continue, but changed. A flood leaves silt. It changes the shape of fields. It changes the memory of people. The world after is not the world before, even if the sun still rises. You stand with Ziusudra on damp ground, looking at a landscape that feels both familiar and newly scrubbed raw. And you notice something crucial for your calm comparison. This Sumerian version carries a tone of ritual legitimacy. The hero survives because he is properly aligned, because he listens, because he performs the right acts. It is less about moral guilt and more about maintaining cosmic and civic order. Later versions will introduce different motives for the flood, different divine emotions, and different emphases. But this one feels like an early chord. The world is fragile. The gods can reset it, and survival belongs to the one who knows how to listen. You walk forward, and the river beside you sounds softer now, like it is approving of your patience. The next current you will step into is sharper and more talkative. It carries an Akkadian complaint that feels almost absurdly human. The gods, it seems, cannot sleep because people are being too noisy. And you, standing there in the dark with your fan humming, can already sense how that shift will change everything. You drift onward and the tone changes in the way a room changes when someone clears their throat to complain. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough to tell you the next version has opinions. The air feels the same, the rivers still run, the mud still clings to your sandals like it's emotionally attached. But the story's logic shifts. You are now standing in the world of Atrahasis, where the gods are less like distant cosmic principles and more like an exhausted administration trying to manage a civilization that has gotten a bit too enthusiastic. You picture the early days first, because Atrahasis does not begin with a flood. It begins with labor. The gods, in this telling, have jobs. Some of them dig canals, haul earth, and do the kind of back-breaking work that makes you understand why people invented bureaucracy. They get tired. They get resentful. They do what any workforce does when pushed too far. They protest. This is your mainstream historical fact for the section, tucked into the narrative like a steady stone. Mesopotamian society depended heavily on organized labor for irrigation, agriculture, and monumental building projects, and texts from the region reflect a deep awareness of work, duty, and the strain of sustaining large systems. When the myth frames divine beings as laborers, it mirrors a world where the maintenance of canals and cities is the central, exhausting reality. So in the story, the gods solve their labor problem by creating humans, not as a romantic creation moment, but as a practical staffing decision. Humans are made to take over the digging and hauling, to keep the world running while the gods enjoy the benefits. It is myth, yes, but it has a strange corporate vibe. You can almost imagine a divine memo. Due to ongoing workload concerns, we are onboarding a new species. And you, being you, are already thinking, this will go badly. Because whenever someone creates a whole species to fix a scheduling issue, there are going to be consequences. At first, the plan works. Humans multiply. Cities expand. Fields spread. Songs rise from courtyards. Babies cry. Dogs bark. Donkeys bray. And then the gods, especially one high god in particular depending on the telling, start to complain that the humans are too noisy. Not evil, not sinful, no grand moral accusation, just loud. You can feel how different this motive is from the more ritual legitimacy of Ziusudra. This is not about cosmic order being offended. This is about divine sleep being interrupted. It is the oldest neighbor complaint story in history. Except your neighbor is a sky god, and his solution is natural disasters. The idea is almost funny in a way that stays PG-13 and sleepy. You imagine the gods lying awake like, do they have to invent singing at midnight? And yes, humans absolutely would. Humans are the species that will throw a party in a floodplain and then act surprised when water shows up. So the gods try smaller population controls first. In Atrahasis, there are earlier calamities. Plague, drought, famine. Each time, humans suffer. And each time Atrahasis, the wise man, finds a way to petition, to pray, to adjust behavior so that the disaster lifts. The story becomes a cycle. The gods send a crisis, humans respond, and order resumes. It's like the universe keeps hitting reset, but only halfway. And you can feel the tension building toward the ultimate reset. The flood. You walk beside Atrahasis, and he feels different from Ziusudra. Ziusudra is devotional and ritual. Atrahasis is clever and resilient. He's a problem solver. He knows who to call, which god to appeal to, which ritual lever to pull. He feels like the friend who always knows the right person at the office to fix your paperwork. You can almost hear him saying, "No worries. I've got a guy." Except the guy is a god of wisdom. And here is where your calm comparison sharpens. In Atrahasis, the divine world is divided. Not all gods agree with the harsh solution. There is compassion, or at least practical concern, in the divine ranks. The flood plan is made in a council, and secrecy becomes a thing. But the wise god, often Enki or Ea in Akkadian tradition, is not comfortable with complete annihilation. He finds a loophole. And again. The loophole is deliciously mythic. He can't directly warn Atrahasis if bound by oath, so he speaks to a wall, or to reeds, or to a structure. Letting Atrahasis overhear. You're standing there like, ah yes, the classic, I'm not telling you, telling you. Now the instruction comes. Build a boat. The details are practical enough that you can imagine people actually attempting it. Smearing bitumen, binding planks or reeds, sealing seams. You smell that tar-like pitch again. Heavy and sharp. The scent of desperation turned into waterproofing. Atrahasis is told to bring life aboard, not only animals, but also the essentials of continuity. The story understands something deep. After a disaster, survival is not just breathing. It is bringing the toolkit of society forward. Seeds, skills, knowledge, and the capacity to restart. Then the flood arrives, and you feel the Akkadian style take over with more texture. The storm is fierce. The wind is a force. The rain is not poetic. It is relentless. And still, the narrative does not become a horror movie. It stays in that ancient mode where the terror is real but described with a certain formal restraint, like a ritual recitation of catastrophe. You are in the boat, and the world outside is water and noise. Ironically, the very thing the gods were trying to stop. The gods wanted quiet, and they created the loudest possible solution. It's almost comedic, if you let yourself smile lightly in the dark. Now comes one of the most memorable post-flood scenes that echoes across Mesopotamian tellings, the sacrifice and the god's reaction. After the waters recede and Atrahasis offers an offering, the gods are drawn to the smell. In some versions they gather like flies, which is one of those lines that feels blunt, earthy, and almost rude toward the divine. It suggests hunger, need, dependence. The gods are not only powerful, they also rely on offerings, on human worship, on the system they themselves endangered. This is where the story reveals its tension. If you wipe out humans completely, you lose the very beings who feed the gods with rituals and attention. The administration cannot function without staff. Apparently, and here is your open debate phrase, eased in like a low tide. Historians still argue whether the humans are too noisy motive reflects an older Mesopotamian tradition about population pressure and resource strain, or whether it is a literary device that lets the story explore the consequences of creating humanity for labor without making the gods look morally monstrous. You can see both possibilities. On one hand, it mirrors a real world where too many mouths in a fragile agricultural system can be a crisis. On the other, it gives the gods a petty, almost domestic excuse that keeps the myth from turning into a simple moral tale. It stays complicated, it stays human, ironically. Another quirky fringe tidbit, gentle and contained. Some people love to read Atrahasis as a coded memory of ancient population control policies or even genetic engineering, because the story includes creation details and divine planning that feel, to modern ears, oddly procedural. It's tempting to imagine ancient people whispering about secret science, but you are standing here in a world of reed boats and clay tablets, and the calmer reading is that myth often uses the language of craft and procedure to make cosmic ideas feel graspable. Creating humans out of clay and divine essence is not a lab report. It is a metaphor that speaks to a society of potters, builders, and ritual specialists. The flood's aftermath in Atrahasis is especially important for your comparison because it shows negotiation. The gods, realizing they went too far, institute measures to prevent humanity from becoming too numerous again. Different versions mention things like mortality, infertility, social constraints, and the introduction of priestly or cultural mechanisms that limit growth. The myth becomes an explanation for why humans die, why not every pregnancy results in a child, why life is bounded. It is not just a story about a boat. It is a story about limits. You step back onto land with Atrahasis, and the world feels quiet. Finally, the gods got what they wanted: silence. But it's the silence after loss, the hush of a city street after a storm, when you can hear your own breathing and it feels too loud. The story does not celebrate that hush. It uses it. It turns it into a reason for the gods to change policy, to be more careful with their power, to acknowledge dependence on humans. And as you keep walking down the riverbank, you feel the next current approaching, smoother and more literary, because soon you will meet Utnapishtim through the Epic of Gilgamesh. That version will carry the flood as a memory inside another story, like a dream you can't quite shake. The boat will get more measurements. The grief will get a quieter dignity, and you, still calm, will notice how the same flood becomes a different kind of mirror depending on who is doing the telling. You keep moving and the flood story slips into a new container, like water poured from one jar into another. Now it sits inside a bigger narrative, tucked into the Epic of Gilgamesh like a memory someone cannot stop replaying. The night around you feels a bit more polished, more literary, as if the language has been rubbed smooth by many hands. You're walking alongside Gilgamesh's long, tired search for meaning. And then you reach the moment where he meets Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who is alive in a way that should make you uneasy. Because if someone has outlived everyone they ever knew, their small talk is either going to be cosmic wisdom or unbearable. Sometimes both. Utnapishtim's home is distant, separated from ordinary people by geography and by the simple fact that he is not supposed to be here anymore. He feels like a living exception, and that already tells you something about this version. The flood is not only a disaster story, it is a hinge in the human condition, a dividing line between what humans can hope for and what they cannot. Gilgamesh wants immortality. Utnapishtim has it. The flood becomes the proof that immortality is not earned by strength or kingship. It is granted once, under special circumstances, and then locked away like a secret you are not meant to touch. You sit with them, with the river sound in your ears like soft static, and Utnapishtim begins to speak. The flood story comes out of him not as excitement, but as recollection, steady and a little resigned. This is your mainstream historical fact for this section, woven in like a quiet anchor. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the best-known works of Mesopotamian literature. Preserved in Akkadian on tablets including the standard Babylonian version, and it contains a flood narrative closely related to other Akkadian traditions. The fact that the flood appears inside this epic shows how these stories are not isolated. They are reusable cultural memory, inserted where they serve a new purpose. Utnapishtim's telling begins with the gods again, and again you can feel division in the divine world. A council decides on the flood, and secrecy is emphasized. The story wants you to feel the weight of a decision made above human hearing. Then comes the loophole. The wise god, cannot directly betray the oath. So he speaks to a reed wall, letting Utnapishtim overhear. You smile softly because it is the same old trick, and it keeps showing up like a beloved plot device. The ancient equivalent of, "I didn't tell you, but I told you," if divine politics were a TV show. The reed wall would deserve a supporting actor award. Now the practical part arrives, and in the Gilgamesh version it is especially tactile. Utnapishtim describes building the boat with a focus that feels almost like instructions, and you can feel why this account is so famous. It is detailed, it is measured, it is matter-of-fact, not romantic, not mystical. It's get the materials, seal the seams, follow the plan. You can smell the bitumen again, thick and sticky, and you can picture workers hauling supplies. You hear the thud of timber, the slap of wet pitch, the sharp calls of laborers coordinating. This is not just a man with a hammer. It is a whole community effort. Even if the story frames it through one survivor, and you notice something quietly clever. Utnapishtim gives reasons to the surrounding people, explanations that keep them from suspecting the real plan. He tells them something like a cover story, depending on translation and reconstruction, implying he is leaving because the god is angry or because he's going to live somewhere else. It is the ancient version of telling your neighbors, "Oh, this giant boat in my driveway. It's a renovation project." You can't help it. That's joke number 1 for this section, and you let it be gentle because the rest is heavy enough. Then the flood arrives, and the Gilgamesh telling gives you some of the strongest imagery while still maintaining that ritual restraint. The storm is unleashed, the wind screams, the rain hammers. Darkness covers the land. The gods themselves become afraid, according to the narrative. And this is one of the most fascinating points in your calm comparison. The gods trigger a force so intense that even they recoil. They huddle, they weep, they regret, they panic. You can feel the story wrestling with power. If the gods can destroy everything, can they control the consequences of that destruction, or does the flood reveal that even divine will has limits once unleashed? This sets up your open, scholarly debate phrase, sliding in like a low, thoughtful wave. Historians still argue whether the depiction of frightened, regretful gods in the Gilgamesh flood account reflects a theological shift toward more emotionally complex deities, or whether it is a literary strategy that humanizes the gods to make the catastrophe feel morally and psychologically real. You can see both readings. A god that never doubts is simple. A god that regrets is a problem, but also a mirror of human experience. And stories love mirrors. Inside the boat, the human experience is smaller. Utnapishtim rides out the storm, and the telling makes you feel the claustrophobia. The boat is a sealed world. Outside is formless water. Inside is breath, animal sounds, human whispers. Fear held down like a lid on a boiling pot. Again, no melodrama. Just the understanding that survival is waiting. It is enduring. It is being forced to exist in a little box while the world is scrubbed away. After days, the water begins to recede. The boat lodges against something, and the Gilgamesh account names a mountain often associated with Nisir in many translations. Whether that reference maps neatly onto a specific modern location is debated. But in the story, it functions as the first solid point in a world of liquid uncertainty. You feel the boat settle. The air shifts. The sound of water changes from roaring to lapping. Relief is not an explosion. It is a quiet loosening in the chest. Like your body finally remembers it can exhale. Then comes the bird sequence, one of the most recognizable motifs. Utnapishtim releases birds to test for land. A dove goes out and returns. A swallow goes out and returns. A raven goes out, finds something, and does not come back. This little experiment is both practical and symbolic. It is proof that the world is returning. It is also a kind of gentle suspense, because the birds are doing the scouting so the humans do not have to. You watch the birds vanish into the brightening air, and you understand why this detail echoes across cultures. It's simple. It's visual. It's something you could imagine doing if you were trapped in a floating box, wondering if the world still exists. When Utnapishtim finally steps out, he makes an offering. And here comes the moment that always lands in a quiet, unsettling way. The gods gather around the sacrifice, drawn by the smell. In the Gilgamesh account, they cluster like flies, which is both vivid and faintly disrespectful. It suggests hunger, dependence, maybe even shame. The gods wanted to reduce humans. Now they are reminded that humans provide offerings. The system is interdependent. You cannot burn down your own kitchen and still expect dinner. The goddess, often Ishtar in this account, expresses grief and anger at the destruction. And there is a scene involving a necklace or jeweled symbol, a token she raises, swearing she will remember. It's a promise shaped like an object, which is a very human thing to do. When words feel too thin, you cling to something you can hold. The gods argue. One god accuses another. Ea confronts the leader of the flood plan, questioning the excess. The flood becomes not only a human tragedy, but a divine conflict. A lesson learned the hard way. And then comes the reward. Utnapishtim and his wife are granted immortality, set apart to live far away. This is a turning point for the whole epic, because Gilgamesh hears it and realizes the cruel simplicity of it. Immortality was not achieved by striving. It was a one-time exception. You can almost see Gilgamesh's shoulders droop, and you can feel the flood story functioning here as philosophy. It is not only, here's how you survive a flood. It is, here's why you, personally, will not outrun death. Cozy bedtime content, I know, but we're doing it calmly with a fan on. Now, your quirky fringe tidbit for this section, kept gentle. Some modern readers fixate on the boat's described proportions and materials, trying to reverse engineer it as if it were a literal blueprint for an actual seaworthy vessel. And some even claim it proves advanced ancient engineering beyond what we expect. The calmer reality is that Mesopotamians were skilled builders and boat makers, especially with reed boats sealed in bitumen and wooden vessels for rivers. And literary descriptions can blend practical knowledge with symbolic completeness. The measurements can signal totality, order, and intentional design. Not necessarily a museum-ready construction plan. It is still impressive. But it does not need sci-fi. You linger with Utnapishtim's voice as it trails off. He has told his story. The flood sits between you like a quiet lake, reflecting the faces of gods and men. And as you keep walking, you can feel how this account differs from Ziusudra's ritual legitimacy and Atrahasis's divine noise complaint. Here, the flood is memory that teaches limits. It is an argument inside an epic about life's boundaries. It is practical detail fused with existential weight. Your next steps will carry you into a softer, careful comparison of divine motives. Because now you have three currents in your hands: the ritual survivor, the clever survivor, and the immortal survivor. The same water, the same reset. But three different reasons and three different moods. And you, still calm, are ready to notice the polite contradictions the ancient scribes never bothered to iron out. You keep walking and the flood stories begin to overlap in your mind, the way two river currents meet and keep their colors for a while before blending. You are not switching to a new tale so much as stepping back, letting your eyes soften, and comparing what you have already heard. The calm part is important. You are not here to declare which version is right, because Mesopotamian scribes were not running a courtroom. They were preserving meaning, and meaning can survive in contradiction, like two truths living side by side in the same neighborhood, politely avoiding each other at the market. So you settle into the question that seems simple and then refuses to be: why does the flood happen at all? In the Sudra stream, the motive feels like divine decree, a cosmic reset that is not fully explained in the surviving fragments, but still carries the sense that the gods decide and the world must obey. The emphasis is on proper alignment and ritual survival. In Eterhasis, the motive is almost comically domestic. Humans are noisy, numerous, and disruptive, keeping the gods awake. That noise can symbolize population pressure and social strain, but the literal framing is still funny in a dry, sleepy way. In the Gilgamesh account, the motive is present but wrapped in the epic's larger themes, and the gods' regret becomes part of the point. They unleash a force that terrifies even them. And then they scramble to manage the consequences. You can feel three different divine personalities right there, even before you compare the details. This is your mainstream historical fact for this section, placed gently like a stepping stone. Mesopotamian mythology is not a single, uniform theology, but a shifting set of traditions across cities, languages, and time periods, with gods who can be emphasized differently depending on the text's origin, audience, and purpose. The flood story's motives vary because Mesopotamian religion itself is a living system, not a locked doctrine. You stand in your imagination before a divine council that keeps changing its meeting minutes. Sometimes the chief deity driving the flood is Enlil, the authority figure associated with wind and command, who feels like the strict administrator of cosmic order. Sometimes the wise god Ea Enki is the sympathetic loophole finder who cannot resist helping humans. Sometimes a goddess voice rises in grief, because the story wants you to feel that destruction is not clean, not tidy, not emotionally neutral. When you compare motives, you're comparing which divine voice the text wants to foreground. And the polite contradictions are everywhere. If you look with soft eyes, in one stream, humans exist partly to serve the gods with labor, digging canals and maintaining the world. So destroying them completely is self-sabotage. In another stream, the gods seem perfectly willing to wipe humanity out and only later remember. Oh, right, offerings. In some tellings, the flood feels like punishment, even if the reason is not moral wrongdoing in the modern sense. In others, it feels like population management, a reset of numbers rather than a moral verdict. You can almost hear the scribes shrugging. They do not force a single rationale. They preserve multiple rationales, because real life is like that. People experience disaster and ask why. They come up with different answers. The stories keep those answers. Here comes your first light joke of the section, because you deserve a small smile. The gods in these texts sometimes feel like they are running the world the way someone runs a group chat, sending a dramatic "I'm leaving" message, deleting the chat, and then immediately realizing they still needed everyone's phone numbers. Flood as divine. Oops, my bad. But you don't linger in that sarcasm. You let it float away, because under it is something serious. The flood motive is often less about humans being bad and more about humans being too much, too loud, too numerous, too hard to manage. That framing tells you something about the environment. Mesopotamia is fertile but fragile. Agriculture depends on controlled irrigation. A small disruption can ripple outward. So a myth that links human growth with cosmic instability is a myth reflecting a real anxiety. There is a carrying capacity here. There are limits. The land can be generous, but it can also punish you with salt buildup, crop failures, and flood damage. Humans pushing too hard can invite collapse, and the myth turns that collapse into a divine decision. Now your open scholarly debate phrase slips in naturally, like your foot finding a shallow place in the river. Historians still argue whether the shifting motives in Mesopotamian flood narratives represent deliberate theological pluralism, where multiple truths are accepted, or whether they reflect the layered composition of texts that combine older oral traditions with later scribal editing, creating seams that modern readers can still detect. You can feel the difference between those ideas. In the first, contradiction is a feature. In the second, contradiction is evidence of stitching. Either way, the result is the same. You're holding a patchwork that is still warm from human hands. You start noticing small motive details that behave like fingerprints. In Atrahasis, the god's annoyance with noise is paired with earlier disasters. Drought, famine, plague. These are attempts to reduce humanity without total annihilation. That suggests a divine world that escalates, experiments, and learns. In the Gilgamesh telling, the flood is more absolute, and the god's regret is sharper, as if the story wants to highlight the danger of overreaction. It is like the difference between someone lowering the thermostat and someone smashing the air conditioner with a hammer because it made a sound. The first is management. The second is chaos. Zayasudra's story, at least in what survives, does not linger on the god's emotional arc in the same way. It feels older in tone, more formal, like a ritual memory rather than a dramatic argument between deities. The motive is less spelled out, but the effect is clear. The gods can reorder the world. The survivor is chosen and aligned. This may reflect an earlier style of myth where the hu is less important than the demonstration of divine authority and the reaffirmation of kingship and ritual correctness after disaster. Now, you allow yourself a quirky tidbit, because the human brain loves a side alley. There's a fringe idea that the varying motives prove these accounts are not myths at all, but different reports from different groups about a single event, with each group rationalizing it differently. It's a seductive thought, like imagining 3 eyewitnesses describing the same storm. But the calmer view is that myths are not just memories, they are frameworks. They use shared narrative bones to address different social needs. One community might emphasize the need for proper ritual alignment. Another might emphasize divine frustration with disorder. Another might use the flood as a philosophical boundary in a hero's quest. The same bones, different muscles. You stand quietly with the god's motives and notice something else. The flood is a story about governance. Divine governance, yes, but also human governance. When a myth shows gods arguing over whether the flood was too harsh, it is indirectly exploring what good leadership looks like. Is it strict? Is it compassionate? Is it measured? Does it plan for consequences? Mesopotamian kings lived under the shadow of this question because their legitimacy depended on maintaining order. Like the gods were supposed to, a flood that wipes out order is a nightmare mirror of failed kingship. And a survivor who restores order is the ideal of continuity. This is where the calm comparison deepens. You're not only comparing motives as excuses, you're comparing motives as messages. The noise complaint tells you that unchecked expansion brings backlash. The cosmic decree tells you that order depends on divine favor and ritual stability. The regretful gods tell you that power must be used carefully because consequences can exceed intention. None of these motives cancel the others. They sit together, like three lamps in the same room, lighting different corners. You let the lamps glow. You imagine the scribes again, pressing wedges into clay. Perhaps one scribe prefers the administrative logic of Atrahasis. Another prefers the formal tone of Ziusudra. Another prefers the poetic, existential framing of Gilgamesh. They copy what they inherit, but they also choose what to emphasize. They shape the memory. They keep the contradictions because the contradictions are honest about human life. Disaster rarely comes with a single, neat reason. Your second light joke arrives softly. If humans were truly wiped out for being too loud, you suspect the gods would have started with the guy who keeps yelling at his donkey in the market, like the donkey understands deadlines. The donkey does not understand. By the way, the donkey is doing its best, and the gods, in these stories, are doing something like their best too, in a messy, flawed, very human way. You continue walking, and the river beside you reflects starlight. You feel calmer, because comparison is like putting things in a tray instead of holding them in your arms. You can see patterns. You can see differences. You can see that the flood story is not one moral lesson delivered once. It is a conversation across centuries about limits, authority, and survival. And now you are ready to look at the next layer, the one you can almost touch. The actual ark-building details, reeds, wood, bitumen, measurements, compartments, the practical obsession with sealing. Because even if the motives differ, the craft of survival keeps reappearing, like a quiet respect for human hands doing real work against a very old river. You step forward, and the stories stop arguing about motives for a moment and start showing you hands at work. This is the part where you can almost feel the materials, where survival becomes craft and the flood narrative turns from divine politics into a checklist. Not a frantic checklist, though a steady one. Because in these Mesopotamian tellings, the boat is not a magical object that appears when the plot needs it. It is something built, sealed, reinforced, and trusted, which is a terrifying amount of faith to place in woodworking and sticky tar. You walk along the riverbank and the smell of bitumen comes back, thick as black honey, sharp enough to wake you if you are about to doze off. You see reed bundles stacked like sleeping animals, tied tight with rope. You hear the creak of timber, the low grunt of lifting, the slap of wet clay under feet. This is the space where myth and real technology overlap. And it is your mainstream historical fact for the section. Mesopotamians built boats using reeds and wood, and they used bitumen as a waterproofing agent for everything from boats to building materials. Bitumen was a known and traded resource in the region. When flood stories describe sealing a vessel with pitch, that detail fits the practical realities of Mesopotamian life. Now, the boat in each telling has its own flavor. In the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh streams, the instructions feel unusually specific, as if the story is proud of its engineering. You get proportions and compartments, the sense of a structured vessel rather than a vague big boat. In the Gilgamesh version especially, The boat is described with a kind of mathematical calm. Like Utnapishtim is recounting the measurements the way someone might recite a recipe they have made 100 times. He tells you how the structure is divided, how it is sealed, how labor is organized. It is almost soothing. The idea that if you follow steps, you can survive chaos. That's a powerful psychological comfort. The flood is uncontrollable, but the boat is controllable. In the Zayu-Saudra stream, the technical detail is less fully preserved in what survives, and the emphasis sits more on obedience and ritual alignment. But even there, the presence of a vessel implies the same underlying truth. Survival requires preparation, and preparation is physical. You can't pray a door into waterproofness. You have to seal it. You move closer to the build site in your imagination and notice the social aspect. A boat of this scale is not a one-person weekend project. It takes workers, it takes supplies, it takes time. That means the flood hero is not only a solitary survivor, he is a manager, a coordinator, a person who can mobilize labor without tipping off the whole city about what's coming. And that creates a quiet tension in the stories. People help build the thing that will save one family, maybe a few others, while they themselves remain outside the rescue plan. It's unsettling if you stare at it too long. So you let it be one of those truths you notice and then set down gently, like a sharp tool. Here's your first light joke. Because the mind needs a little cushion. You imagine trying to keep a massive boat-building project secret in a tight-knit city. Someone would absolutely post about it. Not online, obviously, but in the ancient equivalent, which is loudly telling their cousin at the water jug. You didn't hear it from me, but there's a huge boat and it smells like tar. Secrecy in a world where everyone lives close together is basically a myth all by itself. Now you focus on the craft details that recur across versions, because comparison loves repetition. Sealing. The repeated emphasis on pitch and sealing tells you the boat is meant to be trusted against prolonged water exposure. Not just a brief crossing. The story's world knows that water gets into everything. If you have ever had a leak in your roof, you already understand Mesopotamian anxiety. Water is patient. It will find the smallest weakness and turn it into a problem. So the boat is layered with protective coating. In literature, that coating becomes a symbol, an intentional barrier between life and chaos. Compartments. The boat is divided, sometimes into levels or sections. On one level, this is practical. Animals and supplies need organization. On another level, it signals order within disorder. Even while the world outside becomes formless water, the boat inside remains structured. You can almost hear the ancient mind insisting some order must remain. Timing and urgency. The instructions often have a compressed timeline, a sense that the build happens quickly, almost miraculously fast. This is where myth quietly bends reality. A boat of huge scale built in a few days is ambitious. But the story is not writing a construction report. It is emphasizing urgency and divine assistance. You feel the tension. Humans can work, but only because a god tipped them off, and because the narrative needs the boat to exist before the rain. Now your open, scholarly debate phrase arrives in a calm, unforced way. Historians still argue whether the boat descriptions in the Akkadian flood accounts preserve echoes of real boat-building knowledge and riverine technology, or whether the measurements are primarily symbolic, expressing completeness and cosmic order rather than literal, buildable specifications. You can hold both ideas at once. The detail can be grounded and symbolic simultaneously. That is what myth loves to do. You also notice what the boat carries. Because cargo is part of the craft, Animals appear, yes, but in Mesopotamian tellings the emphasis often feels broader. Not only living creatures, but also craftsmen, tools, and the essentials of civilization. The flood is not just a test of biological survival. It is a test of cultural survival. In a world where skills are everything, where a potter and a carpenter and a scribe are the difference between we survived and we survived, but we are basically living like feral river goblins, the preservation of knowledge matters. You can almost see a scribe packing clay and a stylus, because even at the end of the world, someone is still thinking about documentation. Humanity, never missing an opportunity to keep records. Your quirky tidbit comes in here, and it's delightfully specific. There is an ancient tradition of describing round or coracle-like boats in Mesopotamia, especially for river travel, made of reeds or wood with a waterproof coating. Some people, noticing that, have suggested the flood vessel in certain tellings might not be a long ship shape at all, but something more boxy or even round in concept. It's not a mainstream certainty, but it's a fascinating possibility because it reminds you that boat in ancient Mesopotamia does not automatically mean the sleek sailing ships your brain might picture from later maritime cultures. In river worlds, stability and buoyancy can matter more than elegance. The flood vessel can be imagined as a floating refuge rather than a seafaring craft. The calmer takeaway is that ancient boat forms were diverse, and the myth can borrow from real local designs while still exaggerating scale for narrative effect. You walk around the imaginary hull and touch the seam where pitch meets reed. It is sticky. It holds. And you feel the psychological heart of the boat detail. It reassures the listener that survival is possible through preparation, obedience, and skill. This is a huge theme across the Mesopotamian flood family. Even when the gods are petty or regretful, the human response is practical. Build, seal, store, organize. Wait. Your second light joke arrives quietly. You imagine the animals on board, somewhere in the dark compartments. A goat is absolutely judging you, not because of the flood, but because goats judge everyone all the time. And you, trying to sleep in a cramped boat while goats do goat things. Realize the flood story is also an ancient reminder that even divine salvation comes with uncomfortable roommates. The craft details also tie back to social control. A ruler who can mobilize labor, secure materials, and execute a plan quickly is a powerful figure. Flood stories, especially those involving kings or wise men, subtly celebrate competence. They suggest that in a world of unpredictable rivers, the best leaders are those who prepare. That's not only myth, that's a survival ethic. As you keep walking, you notice the boat is not the end of the craft. After the flood, there is landing, disembarking, offering, rebuilding, but the boat is the hinge. It is the engineered pause button in a world that has been wiped clean. It is the one structured object that carries the old world into the new. And that brings you to the next calm comparison point, where craft meets proof. The birds, the mountains, and the small tests that tell you the water is retreating. Because once you've built the vessel and endured the storm, the next question is painfully practical. When can you step outside without immediately regretting it? You move on, and the world feels like it is holding its breath. Because in every flood story, there's that long middle stretch where you cannot do anything except wait. And then the moment comes when you have to know if waiting is over. Not guess. No. The water can look calm and still be deadly. The air can smell fresh and still hide the fact that the land is a floating mess. So the stories, practical in their ancient way, give you tests, small proofs. Birds released into the brightening sky, a mountain catching the belly of a boat, a little sign that the world is solid again. You stand in that liminal space with the survivors, the boat no longer fighting waves but resting in a strange quiet. The storm is gone. The silence is different from night silence. It is the silence of something exhausted. Water laps, wood creaks, animals shift. People whisper like the sky might take offense if you speak too loudly, which is a funny callback to the noise complaint motive. And yes, you imagine someone on the boat nudging another like, "Shh, don't wake the gods," which is joke number 1. And it lands softly. The bird sequence is most clearly preserved in the Gilgamesh flood account, and it's one of those details that makes you feel the story's realism, even while you know it's myth. Utnapishtim releases birds in order. A dove goes out and returns because it finds nowhere to land. A swallow goes out and returns, then a raven goes out, and it does not come back, because it finds land, or at least something solid enough to perch on and start living its raven life. This is your mainstream historical fact for the section. Placed gently, birds were familiar, observable markers in Mesopotamian daily life, and using them as environmental indicators is a plausible, practical idea in river and marsh landscapes where water levels determine what is habitable. The story's use of birds as scouts fits real ecological common sense. You watch the birds with the survivors, and you feel how much is packed into this simple test. On the surface, it's just strategy, but it also becomes symbolism. The dove and swallow returning are like the world saying, "Not yet." The raven not returning is like the world saying, "Yes, you can come back." It's a yes you can trust because it comes from an animal that has no reason to comfort you. The raven is not being poetic, it's being opportunistic. And in a flood aftermath, opportunism is a form of truth. Now you widen your gaze to include the mountain motif, because boats in these stories do not just drift forever. They come to rest. In Gilgamesh, the boat lands against a mountain often called Nisir in many translations, and that mountain becomes the first point of stability, the first edge to the watery world. In some traditions, the landing place becomes almost sacred, a geographic anchor for memory. In calmer terms, it's the narrative's way of giving you solidity. Water is formless. A mountain is form. A mountain is what you can touch. But here's where comparison gets interesting. Mesopotamia itself is famously flat in many areas, especially the southern alluvial plain where Sumerian cities flourish. Mountains exist, but not right there. They are to the north and east, toward the Zagros, toward regions where rivers begin and where storms and snowmelt originate. So when a flood story includes a mountain landing, it might signal that the vessel drifts far, or it might simply use mountain as the archetype of high safety. A literary necessity, a symbolic opposite of the flooded plain. Both can be true at once. And here comes your open, scholarly debate phrase, eased into the night like a steady exhale. Historians still argue whether the named landing locations in Mesopotamian flood account preserve a memory of regional geography and travel routes, or whether they function mainly as mythic markers, chosen for their symbolic association with height, refuge, and divine proximity, rather than for any literal cartographic accuracy. You don't need to pick one to appreciate the effect. The mountain, real or symbolic, tells you the same thing. The waters have a limit. You also notice how the bird test and the mountain landing do something psychologically gentle. They turn the end of the flood into a series of steps rather than a sudden switch. That is calming. That is how humans prefer change. Not the world is over, and then the world is back instantly, but a gradual return. The storm ceases. The boat rests. A bird comes back. A bird comes back. A bird does not come back. and only then do you dare to believe. Now let's fold in Ziusudra and Atrahasis again, because even if their surviving details vary, the motif of testing for land is part of the broader family of flood narratives. In Atrahasis, the aftermath also includes the offering and the recognition that survival has consequences. But the bird sequence is not always preserved as explicitly in the fragments we have the way it is in Gilgamesh. That itself is a reminder of how survival of texts shapes what we compare. We are not comparing the full stories as they once existed in every detail. We are comparing what time allowed us to keep. And time, like the river, takes what it wants. Here is your quirky tidbit, soft and strange. Some fringe-minded readers have tried to interpret the birds in the flood story as coded navigation tools or even astronomical symbols. Like the raven equals a certain star, or the dove equals a certain constellation, and the sequence maps onto a sky calendar. It's a creative idea. And you can see why it's tempting, because ancient people watched the sky intensely. But the calmer interpretation is that birds are immediate, local, illegible. You don't need a secret code to explain why someone trapped on a floating vessel would release an animal and see if it returns. It's the ancient equivalent of checking if your Wi-Fi is back by trying to load a web page. Simple, practical, deeply human. You let yourself imagine the moment of release. The survivor opens a hatch. Fresh air pours in. A bird flutters out, wings beating fast against the new brightness. That small movement becomes a huge emotional event because it carries your hope outside the boat. When it returns, hope returns with it, tired and damp. When it doesn't, hope becomes terrifying because now you have to act. You have to leave the safety of your sealed world and step into whatever comes next. That's another subtle point. The boat is not only a refuge, it is also a prison. After days of being inside, the outside becomes unfamiliar. The flood has erased landmarks. Fields are gone. Streets are gone. The familiar world is missing. And you have to rebuild not just physically, but mentally. The bird test gives you permission to face that. Your second light joke arrives, because we're keeping it gentle. You imagine the survivor doing this test with modern impatience. Like, okay, dove, do your job. And the dove, unimpressed, circles and comes back like, nope. Still water, also your boat smells weird. And yes, the boat absolutely smells weird. It's animals, humans, damp wood, and tar. It's basically the world's least relaxing spa. The bird sequence also ties into a larger pattern of small proofs across ancient storytelling. Big events are too overwhelming to grasp all at once. So stories use small signs. A bird, a resting boat, a patch of land, a change in wind. These are the sensory clues that make the myth feel lived in. They are the pieces you can picture in your own mind, even if you have never seen a river flood like this. And now, as you keep walking in the dark, you feel the next part approaching. What happens when you step out and the world is still raw? In the Mesopotamian tellings, the answer is almost always the same in structure. Even if the emotions vary, you offer something. You reconnect with the divine. You negotiate the future. The birds and mountains are proof that the old disaster is ending. The next steps are about ensuring it does not happen again, or at least not in the same way. So the current carries you forward toward promises, restraint, and the post-flood mood that feels like a treaty signed in ash and incense. You can almost smell the first smoke of an offering rising into a sky that has finally stopped yelling. You step forward, and the air changes from damp survival to that strange, fragile calm that follows a huge event. when everything feels newly quiet and you start noticing little sounds again. A reed creaks, a bird calls, someone coughs and it feels loud, like the whole world might look over and judge them. This is where the flood story, across Mesopotamia, shifts from "how did you survive" to "how do you keep living without the sky deciding to do that again?" You arrive at the moment that shows up like a familiar ritual gesture in different tellings. The offering. The survivor steps out, finds ground, and makes smoke, incense, roasted meat, grain, whatever the narrative emphasizes. The point is the same. You send something upward. You make a connection. You remind the gods that you exist and you are still participating in the relationship. It is not dramatic. It is practical. It is the same instinct as sending a message after a long silence. Hey, I'm here. Please don't delete me. This is your mainstream historical fact for the section. Folded in gently, offerings and sacrifices were central to Mesopotamian religious practice, performed in temples and households as part of maintaining reciprocal relationships with deities. The flood survivor's sacrifice mirrors real ritual logic, where humans provide food and honor to gods in exchange for protection and order. In the Gilgamesh telling, the gods respond in a way that is both vivid and slightly embarrassing for them. They gather around the offering like flies, drawn by the smell, which makes you feel the uncomfortable idea that gods rely on humans for ritual nourishment. It is not just gratitude on the human side, it is also relief on the divine side. Humans are back. The system of offerings can continue. The flood, in this view, threatens the god's own ecosystem of worship. That dependency makes the post-flood moment feel like negotiation rather than pure judgment. In Atrahasis, the offering scene also carries a policy shift. The gods recognize that total annihilation is not workable, and they institute limits so humanity won't grow too much again. The mood is not thunderous covenant. It is bureaucratic compromise. You can almost feel a divine checklist being rewritten. Okay, no more full wipe. Implement mortality. Implement social constraints. Manage population. It's ancient myth, but the logic is weirdly familiar if you have ever watched a large organization solve a problem by creating 3 new rules that everyone will immediately find loopholes around. And in the Sudra stream, although the fragments are less complete, the post-flood blessing and the granting of special status to the survivor carry a quieter covenant mood. The gods acknowledge the survivor, affirm continuity, and re-establish order. It is less about a public promise and more about an outcome. The world is allowed to continue, and the survivor becomes a bridge between eras. Now you feel the covenant mood across these traditions. Even without a single standardized vow, there's a shared sense that the flood is a boundary event, and boundaries invite agreements. Something has been learned. Something must change. The gods, in different ways, signal restraint, or at least they signal a desire not to repeat the same mistake because it turned out messy, inconvenient, and emotionally complicated. Here comes your open scholarly debate phrase, because this is exactly the kind of place scholars love to argue. Historians still argue whether the post-flood negotiations in Mesopotamian texts reflect genuine theological ideas about divine restraint and reciprocity, or whether they primarily serve as narrative solutions to a practical mythic problem. Namely, how to explain ongoing human suffering and mortality after a world reset story without making the gods look permanently irrational. You can feel the tension. If the gods can wipe everything out, why don't they do it again? The story needs an answer. The answer can be, they promised, or they regretted, or they set limits, or sometimes all 3. Now your quirky tidbit slides in softly. There's a fringe-flavored angle some people like to take where the post-flood promise is treated like evidence of an ancient contract, almost legalistic, between humans and gods, as if myth is recording the terms of civilization in a literal sense. It's not entirely wild to think of myths as social contracts, but the calmer approach is that these stories dramatize the logic of reciprocity that already exists in daily ritual life. Offerings are not just gifts, they are participation. When you make an offering, you are saying, I acknowledge the cosmic order. I will behave as a subject within it. The gods, in return, are expected to maintain stability. The flood breaks that expectation. The post-flood offering repairs it. You watch the smoke rise. The sky's clearer now, and the emotional tone in the divine world is one of the most fascinating comparison points. In Gilgamesh, you see divine regret and fear. The gods huddle. They weep. A goddess laments the loss. There is arguing. Ea scolds Enlil for overdoing it. This is not a neat, confident pantheon. It is a pantheon that makes mistakes and then tries to manage fallout. That makes the promise mood feel fragile, like a ceasefire rather than a triumphant new era. In Atrahasis, the gods are more managerial. They implement mechanisms. The promise is not just, we won't do it again. It is, we will adjust the system so it doesn't get to that point. Mortality becomes part of the policy. Certain social structures become part of the policy. The myth offers an explanation for why life is bounded and why suffering continues even after the flood. The flood is not the end of hardship. It is the moment hardship is formally built into the human condition. In Zayas Udra, the tone is more like divine recognition of a faithful servant. The agreement is implicit. Alignment with the divine order is rewarded, and the world's continuity is affirmed. It feels less like a heated meeting and more like a formal blessing after a crisis. You let all that sit for a moment, and you notice the calm irony. The gods destroy humanity because of disorder, and then they restore order by returning to ritual. Smoke rises, offerings are made, the relationship is reset. So the flood is both a rupture and a reaffirmation. It breaks the system, and then insists the system is necessary. Here is your first light joke, because even sacred smoke can handle it. You imagine the gods gathering around the offering smell like someone drifting into a kitchen because they weren't hungry, but then mysteriously appear the moment something good is cooking. Ancient divinity, modern snack behavior. And you, being you, are silently thinking. So you wiped out the world and now you're here for barbecue. You let the humor be small, because the underlying point is heavy. The myth is showing divine dependence and divine embarrassment in the same breath. Now your second light joke arrives as a gentle aside. You picture the survivor carefully arranging an altar, and one of the animals that just survived the flood is watching like. You're doing what now, after all that? Survival does not automatically create understanding. It creates routines, and routines are comforting. Even when they're confusing, you keep the focus on the calm comparison. The post-flood promise is not always explicit, but restraint is implied. The gods argue, but the outcome is continuity with conditions. Humans will keep living, but not in unlimited expansion, not in immortal ease. With limits, with death, with rules. That is how Mesopotamian myths often work. They explain not only origins, but also constraints. They make the world's harshness feel like part of a negotiated arrangement rather than random cruelty. And then you start to sense the next current pulling at you. After the agreement mood comes the rebuilding mood, because a promise does not plant crops. A blessing does not reopen canals. You still have to restart society, assign labor, rebuild cities, and decide who rules. Flood stories, especially in Mesopotamia, are never only about one family in a boat. They're also about kingship, cities, and the human need to reconstruct order on mud that has been reset. So you follow the smoke as it thins into the night sky, and you walk toward the first signs of people gathering again, measuring land, planning walls, and quietly asking the question that sits under every post-disaster moment. Okay, but how do we do this again? You keep moving, and the story's focus slides from survival into logistics, which sounds unromantic until you remember that civilization is mostly logistics, wearing a nicer outfit. The flood has ended, the offering smoke has thinned, and now you're standing in the messy, damp aftermath where the real work begins. The ground is soft, the air smells like silt, and the horizon looks empty in a way that makes you feel small. In flood stories, this is the quiet terror. Not the storm, but the restart. You watch people step out and immediately face questions that no epic hero wants to answer. Where is the nearest clean water? Which field boundary still exists? Where did the grain stores go? Who's in charge now? If you're being honest, you would probably stand there for a full minute like you just woke up from a nap and forgot your own name. That's joke number one. Gentle and true. This is where Mesopotamian flood narratives connect to something very concrete. Cities. Mesopotamia is not a wilderness culture in its self-image. It is an urban culture with walls, temples, markets, scribes, and kings. And that gives you your mainstream historical fact for this section. Laid down like a brick, Mesopotamian society organized itself around city-states and later empires, with kingship playing a central role in maintaining order, managing irrigation, and supporting temple institutions. Floods were not only natural disasters, they threatened the infrastructure and political legitimacy that held city life together. So when a flood story imagines a world reset, it is not imagining a romantic return to nature. It is imagining a terrifying interruption of urban order. The question is not, can you live off the land? The question is, can you rebuild the systems that make life predictable? You see this in the way the survivor is framed. Zeusudra is a king, which matters. Atrahasis is a wise man, close to divine counsel. Utnapishtim becomes a special case, removed from ordinary society. But his story is told within an epic that is obsessed with kingship and what it means to rule. These are not random survivors. They are figures with authority, legitimacy, or wisdom. In a Mesopotamian mindset, if the world is going to restart, it needs a credible anchor. It needs someone who can stand on newly dried ground and say, "We do this now," and people will listen. And here's the calm comparison point. The flood stories don't just preserve animals and humans. They preserve the idea of hierarchy, even after the world is wiped clean. The story does not dream of equal distribution and communal utopia. It tends to reassert structure. Kingship returns. Temples return. Offerings return. Work returns. The restart is not freedom. The restart is the resumption of order, which includes power. You can almost feel the ancient logic. Chaos is water. Order is city. So rebuilding a city, even symbolically, is rebuilding the cosmos. Now you begin to notice how flood myths can function as origin stories for political legitimacy. If a king or a proto-king survives the flood and receives divine favor, then the line of kingship after the flood is, by implication, sanctioned. In some traditions, kingship itself is said to descend from heaven, a phrase that shows up in Mesopotamian thought about legitimacy. A flood reset can become a mythic break between an earlier era and a new era, allowing later rulers and scribes to imagine a fresh start in the chain of authority. Here comes your open, scholarly debate phrase, eased in like a slow turning of a tablet in the hand. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian flood narratives primarily served as theological reflections on human limits and divine power, or whether they also functioned as ideological tools that supported royal and temple authority by framing post-disaster order as divinely endorsed and inevitable. You can see how both can be true. Myths do not have to choose one job. They can do several at once, like a multi-tool that also occasionally stabs you. Now the quirky tidbit, kept soft and non-dramatic. There are modern fringe takes that treat the flood reset as evidence of a literal lost civilization before history begins, with the survivor carrying advanced knowledge to restart humanity. You can imagine the appeal because it turns the flood into a mystery box. But the calmer reading is that Mesopotamian texts often imagine an antediluvian era with different lifespans and kings, not as archaeology, but as a way of marking mythic time, making the past feel immense and qualitatively different. The flood becomes a dividing line between the long ago that feels dreamlike and the after that feels like the world you recognize. With work and limits and mortality, you walk through what the story implies is the first stage of rebuilding, gathering people, assigning tasks, re-establishing ritual. The temple becomes a central anchor because it is where you negotiate stability with the gods. In practical terms, the temple is also an economic hub, storing grain, organizing labor, distributing resources. So when flood myths move toward starting over, the temple's role is implied even when not spelled out. You don't just rebuild houses, you rebuild the center. You also feel the importance of irrigation in the background of these myths. After a flood, canals might be clogged with silt or breached. Fields might be waterlogged or salted. The whole agricultural rhythm can be knocked out of phase. In a region where food security depends on water management, rebuilding canals is rebuilding life itself. That's why a flood story, even when cosmic, is grounded in something very physical, the relationship between humans and their rivers. The same rivers that nourish you can erase you. So post-flood kingship is, in part, post-flood water management. You can almost see a newly appointed official pointing at a canal line and saying, "We dig here," and everyone groaning in unison, because nothing says new era like forced labor with shovels. Here's your second light joke. Because yes, we're going to keep it gentle. You imagine the first post-flood town meeting. Someone raises their hand and asks, "So, are we building near the river again?" And everyone just stares at them like they asked if fire is hot. Of course you build near the river. That's where life is. You can't quit it. It's a toxic relationship, but with water. And that's another deep point. Flood stories do not end with, "and they lived far away from rivers forever." They end with resumption. People go back. They plant again. They rebuild. They accept risk because the alternative is starvation. The myth reflects that stubborn human choice, to live where the world is both generous and dangerous. You notice, too, how memory works. The flood story is a way of remembering vulnerability and teaching preparedness. Even if the flood is mythic, the lesson is practical. Build levees, respect the river, maintain canals, keep offerings, listen to warnings. In that sense, the narrative supports social discipline. It encourages communal work. It legitimizes leadership. It makes the idea of coordinated rebuilding feel sacred. As you walk, the night feels steady. The river sound is quieter now, as if it's done showing off. You can sense the scribes returning to their tablets, not only to tell the story, but to file it into the cultural archive. Here is how the world can end. Here is how it begins again. And you are ready for the next calm shift, because rebuilding is not only physical, it is textual. The flood story itself survives through scribes, through copying, through translation, through small edits and big rearrangements. The next current pulls you into the scribal workshop again, where you can watch versions change in the most human way possible, by being written down by different people with different priorities. You slip back into the scribal world like it's a side room off the main corridor of history. And it feels almost comforting because at least here the chaos is orderly. The flood has done its mythic work. It has reset the world. It has nudged kingship back into place. It has reminded everyone that water is both life and betrayal. Now you watch the quieter miracle, how the story itself survives, not by divine decree, but by bored teenagers and meticulous professionals pressing reeds into clay until the words become durable. The workshop smells like damp earth and faint smoke from a nearby hearth. There are stacks of tablets drying in rows, like little loaves of language. A scribe sits cross-legged, calm and serious, shaping signs that look deceptively simple until you try to imagine memorizing hundreds of them. This is your mainstream historical fact for the section, placed gently. Mesopotamian scribes were trained in formal schools, often called eduba, tablet house, in Sumerian contexts. And they learned by copying standard lists and literary texts. Copying was a key method for preserving and transmitting works across generations and languages. The flood story's survival is not just fate, it is curriculum. You watch a student copy a line and then pause, frown, and scrape the clay to fix a mistake. That tiny moment matters because it shows you how variation is born. Not every difference between versions has to be a grand theological choice. Sometimes it's an error, sometimes it's a correction, sometimes it's a scribe choosing a synonym because a sign is easier, or because the local dialect prefers one word, or because the old tablet they're copying is cracked and they have to guess what the missing sign was. You can feel the story turning into a living thing, changing shape while still staying recognizable, and you start noticing the layers. There's Sumerian and Akkadian, not just as languages, but as cultural lenses. A flood narrative in Sumerian carries older city-state rhythms and ritual tones. An Akkadian version, especially in the later standard Babylonian form, carries broader imperial literary polish, a kind of deliberate artistry. You do not need drama to see this. You see it in word choice, in emphasis, in which God gets the sharpest lines, and which human feels most like the hero the audience wants. You lean over a tablet and picture how a scribe might make an editorial choice that is both tiny and massive. Maybe they add a clarifying line about why the gods are angry, because their audience likes motives spelled out. Maybe they emphasize divine regret, because that suits the tone of an epic about mortality. Maybe they keep the read wall loophole, because everyone loves a good loophole and also it solves a plot problem neatly. That's joke number 1. By the way, you can almost hear the scribe saying, "We can't have Ea directly warn him. That breaks the oath. Quick, get the wall. The wall is our best supporting character." You also notice something calm but important. These texts are not always copied for the same reason. Sometimes they're copied as literature, because they're beautiful and famous. Sometimes they're copied as wisdom, because they teach a worldview. Sometimes they're copied as prestige, because owning and reciting ancient stories makes a court look cultured. And sometimes they're copied because a student needs practice, and the flood story happens to be on the list. That means the flood narrative is both sacred memory and homework assignment, which is honestly the most human thing imaginable. You watch a teacher walk by, glance at a tablet, and tap a line with a fingernail like, "No, no, that sign is wrong." The student nods with the resigned acceptance of someone who has just been corrected in public. Joke number 2. You realize the flood story might have survived partly because it was excellent for teaching, which is hilarious. Because nothing says learn to write like the world ends in water. Imagine your spelling test being apocalyptic. Please write. Then the storm raged for 7 days. Now the comparison deepens. You're not only watching errors and edits, you're watching how whole versions can be shaped by the context that preserve them. The Gilgamesh flood account, for example, exists inside a larger epic, so it is influenced by that epic's themes. The flood becomes a lens on death, on limits, on what a king can and cannot conquer. Atrahasis has a different frame, concerned with labor, population, and the uneasy relationship between gods and the humans made to serve them. Zeusudra, in the Sumerian tradition, feels more like a foundational memory tied to kingship and ritual legitimacy. These are not just different chapters, they are different placements in different literary architectures. So when you say the flood story changes, you mean the story is being used differently, and usage shapes form. A flood narrative used to teach scribal students might emphasize clear structure and repeated motifs. A flood narrative used in a royal court might emphasize divine approval and the continuity of order. A flood narrative embedded in an epic might emphasize existential consequences. You let your fingers hover above the clay and imagine how a scribe might translate from Sumerian into Akkadian, not word for word, but idea for idea, carrying the bones across while changing the flesh. Translation is not neutral. It forces choices. It forces interpretation. A word for storm might have multiple connotations. A title for a god might shift. A line that sounds formal in one language might sound awkward in another. So the scribe smooths it out, and suddenly you have a version that feels new, even if it's built from older material. Here comes your open, scholarly debate phrase. As naturally as a stylus finding clay, historians still argue whether the flood narrative's major differences across Sumerian and Akkadian texts reflect conscious literary reworking by scribes and poets for new audiences, or whether they primarily result from the gradual drift of oral traditions and the practical realities of copying fragmentary source tablets over centuries. You can feel the tug of war between artistry and accident. And the truth can be both. Scribes can be creative, and also constrained. Now the quirky tidbit slips in, quiet and slightly odd. In some ancient scholarly traditions, scribes didn't just copy stories, they also wrote commentaries, lexical lists, and explanatory notes that linked rare words to meanings and grouped signs by category. That means the flood story might be studied not only as narrative, but as a source of vocabulary, metaphors, and cultural reference. In a sense, the flood becomes a teaching tool for language itself. The fringe-ish feeling here is imagining a student memorizing the word for bitumen because the end of the world is apparently the perfect time to learn waterproofing terms. But it's also real. Technical and ritual words matter. And myths preserve them. You watch a scribe select which tablet to copy, and you realize selection is power. If a text is copied, it lives. If it is not copied, it fades. A flood story that resonates gets reproduced, gets polished, gets inserted into new contexts. That selection process can make one version feel canonical in hindsight, even if, in its own time, it was simply one beloved variant among many. The story's survival is shaped by libraries, by temple collections, by royal archives, by the accidents of fire and ruin. Clay tablets survive when they are baked, sometimes unintentionally in building fires, turning fragile clay into ceramic permanence. There is something darkly poetic about that. Destruction can preserve. Fire can save writing. It's like the universe has a twisted sense of archival practice. And you, standing there, feel the calm strangeness of it. The flood story is about catastrophe, but it reaches you through careful, repetitive labor. It is passed hand to hand. It is stabilized by education. It is reshaped by translation. It is made into literature by people who are not thinking about you at all, who are just trying to do their job, serve their temple, impress their king, or simply pass their exams. You lift your gaze from the tablet rows and notice how this scribal motion explains the family resemblance you've been tracking. Motifs persist because they are memorable and teachable. The warning, the boat, the storm, the landing, the bird, the offering, the post-flood adjustment. Variations persist because people in different places and times emphasize different anxieties. Noise, order, mortality, divine regret. The scribal world does not eliminate variation. It manages it. It lets multiple versions coexist, like multiple river channels feeding the same plain. As you step out of the workshop, you feel the next calm current approaching, the question of whether any of this is anchored in real floods. Not one global flood, not cinematic apocalypse, but the very real, very local, very damaging river events that would make a flood story feel less like fantasy and more like a familiar nightmare given mythic shape. You step out of the scribal workshop and back onto the river plain, and the question waiting for you is not loud. It's the kind of question that sits on your shoulder and slowly gets heavier. Okay, but did something like this actually happen? Not the full cosmic reset with every mountain submerged like a bathtub toy, but real floods. The kind that chew through levees, drown fields, and make entire neighborhoods vanish under brown water while everyone stands on rooftops staring at a world that suddenly forgot where the ground is. You're in Mesopotamia now, where rivers are both the reason cities exist and the reason they occasionally panic. You walk along a canal line and imagine how it looks in a good year. Water obediently flowing where people want it. Fields turning green. Grain heads nodding in the breeze. Then you imagine the same canal after an unusually intense season. The banks soften, slump, split. The water finds a weak spot and expands its authority. It spreads, not like a monster, but like a bored ruler who notices there are no guards on the eastern gate. Flooding here can be sudden or creeping, but either way it changes everything. This is your mainstream historical fact for the section. Set down calmly, Mesopotamian cities were built on alluvial plains shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates, and those rivers could flood unpredictably. Managing water through canals, levees, and drainage was essential for agriculture and urban survival. When flood myths feel familiar, it's because the environment constantly reminds people that water management is never fully solved. You can sense how a really bad flood would imprint itself on memory. Not just as we got wet, but as our storehouses failed, our livestock drowned, our boundary stones disappeared, our temple courtyard turned into a pond, the cemetery floated, and the city smells like mud for weeks. A flood like that doesn't need to cover the whole world to feel like the end of the world to the people living through it. Your brain doesn't measure disaster by global scale. It measures it by whether your home is still there. So you begin to understand why a flood story can become universal in tone while still being rooted in local reality. The river plain is a stage for repeated trauma. One community experiences a catastrophic flood and tells a story. Another community hears it, recognizes the anxiety, and adapts it. The narrative grows. It gains gods and councils and birds and measured boats. But the emotional seed can be as simple as, water came where it shouldn't, and we were helpless. You pause near a low mound, an ancient tell, where layers of habitation stack like a cake made of mud brick and time. Flood deposits can be part of those layers. Silt laid down by water, and you feel the temptation, the very modern urge to point at a layer of sediment and declare, that's the flood. It would be so satisfying, like finding the exact scene of a movie. But the river plain is messy. Floods happen more than once. Sediment layers can be local. Different sites can flood at different times. A layer of silt does not automatically mean a single region-wide event, let alone a mythic world reset. The Earth does not label its disasters neatly for your convenience, which is honestly rude. Here comes your open, scholarly debate phrase, easing in like water seeping through a crack. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian flood narratives preserve the cultural memory of one particularly devastating flood event, or whether they are composite myths shaped by many floods across centuries, each contributing a little sediment to the story until it becomes bigger than any single occurrence. You can feel that this debate is less about proving one date and more about understanding how memory and literature interact. A myth can be inspired by reality without being a literal report of it. You keep walking and let the river teach you a small lesson in scale. A flood that destroys one city might spare another 20 miles away, depending on channel shifts, levee conditions, and timing. That means two communities can carry entirely different flood memories. Later, as empires connect regions and scribes share texts, these memories can mingle. The flood story becomes a shared language for vulnerability. It is less this exact event and more this kind of terror. Now, you gently consider what archaeology can and can't do here. Because calm comparison means respecting limits. Archaeologists can find evidence of flooding in some layers at some sites. They can map settlement patterns, see where cities moved or rebuilt. They can study changes in river channels over time. But tying that evidence to a specific named hero from a story is another level of leap. A flood layer says, water did this. The story says, gods did this, and a chosen person survived with a boat. Those are different kinds of truth claims. One is physical, one is narrative meaning. They can touch without merging. Your first light joke slips in, because you can't help imagining how badly you would handle a field season on the alluvial plain. You'd show up with your little notebook, step into mud up to your ankle, and immediately decide you're more of an indoors historian. That's you trying to reconstruct ancient floods while actively being defeated by modern dirt. Very on brand. You keep the mood steady as you think about why these myths emphasize unpredictability. The Tigris and Euphrates do not flood like a neatly scheduled river. In some regions, flooding can come at awkward times for agriculture. That unpredictability would feel like a betrayal. In a world where survival depends on planning and routine, a badly timed flood can feel intentional, like someone chose to ruin you. Myth turns that feeling into a divine council making decisions. It gives agency to chaos, which sounds scary, but can also be psychologically comforting. If there's agency, there might be a way to negotiate it. Offerings, ritual, obedience, a boat. Then you notice how the myth chooses an extreme. The story doesn't just say, bad flood. It says, flood that undoes the world. That's literature doing what it does. It takes a repeated fear and stretches it to its maximum expression so you can see it clearly. If you've lived through multiple near disasters, you eventually imagine the worst one. Your mind rehearses it. Societies rehearse it too, through stories. Now for the quirky tidbit, the one you can glance at without letting it hijack the whole night. There are fringe theories that try to link Mesopotamian flood stories to far-off cataclysms, like sudden ocean surges, comet impacts, or dramatic shifts in Earth's orientation, with the flood myth treated as a preserved technical warning. It's exciting in the way conspiracy-adjacent timelines are exciting, like a roller coaster you don't have to maintain. But the calmer reading is that Mesopotamia has plenty of flood potential built into its everyday geography. You don't need a planet-sized plot twist to explain why people here would imagine water swallowing everything they know. Sometimes the simplest source of awe is the one outside your door. You listen to the river again and think about how stories might spread. Traders travel, soldiers travel, scribes travel, captives travel. Empires move people around like pieces on a board. So even if one city experiences a signature flood, the narrative can travel outward and get adopted by others who have their own flood experiences. The shared story becomes a container large enough to hold many memories. That's why the flood narrative can feel both specific and universal. It has local mud under its nails and big cosmic language in its mouth. Your second light joke arrives. Soft as a yawn, you imagine ancient people arguing about whose flood was worse. Like disaster is a competition. Our canal breached for 7 days. Oh yeah, our granary floated. Humans have been doing the "you think that's bad" routine forever. Apparently, even when the topic is the end of everything, you also consider the role of storytelling after trauma. A massive flood does something to a community's sense of safety. It proves that the world can break. Myths respond by creating a narrative where the break has a reason, even if the reason is annoyingly petty, like you were too loud. The story says, yes, the world can break, but it can also restart. Someone can survive. Order can return. That message is not dramatic. It's stabilizing, and it connects back to why scribes copy these stories. They are not only preserving entertainment, they are preserving a model for resilience. The model says, pay attention, prepare, accept limits, rebuild. It's almost a civic manual wearing mythic clothing. Not because it tells you how many bricks to stack in a levee, but because it teaches you that levees matter. Your third light joke slides in right at the end, because your brain likes a little cushion before moving on. You picture yourself trying to convince a group of ancient workers to reinforce a levee because the myth says floods happen. And they look at you like, we know. We literally live here. Sometimes wisdom literature is just stating the obvious with better poetry. As you keep walking, the riverbank starts to feel less like a set piece and more like a living archive. The land remembers floods in layers. People remember floods in stories. Archaeology reads layers. Literature reads meaning. Neither cancels the other. They hold different kinds of truth, and you are learning to keep both in your hands without squeezing them into the same shape. And now, because you've let reality and myth share the room, you're ready for the next calm question. If these stories resemble each other so closely, is that because they were borrowed and adapted across cultures, or because different communities independently built similar stories from similar experiences? The river currents ahead are about diffusion, influence, and the way ideas travel. You keep walking, and the river plain feels like a map of connections instead of a single place. Paths run between cities. Boats slide along canals. Merchants carry wool, grain, copper, stories, gossip, and the occasional suspiciously confident opinion. And that's where your next calm question lives. When flood stories share so many motifs, is it because one culture borrowed from another, or because multiple communities built similar stories independently from similar rivers, similar fears, and similar human brains. You pause at the edge of an imagined marketplace where languages bump into each other. Someone speaks Sumerian, someone answers in Akkadian, someone mutters in a dialect you barely recognize, and you, being you, nod like you understand. Which is joke number one, because you absolutely don't. But the point is clear. Mesopotamia is not a set of isolated boxes. It's a network. If you want a flood story to travel, this is the perfect environment for it to do so. Quietly, naturally, without needing a dramatic announcement. This is your mainstream historical fact for the section laid down like a steady foundation stone. Across the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, Mesopotamia sees intense cultural contact through trade, diplomacy, migration, and imperial expansion, with Sumerian and Akkadian used in overlapping ways. Scribal education often preserved older Sumerian compositions, while Akkadian became a dominant spoken and literary language. In a world like that, ideas and stories can move along the same routes as goods. So you consider borrowing first, but gently. Because borrowing can sound like theft when it's really more like sharing a melody and then singing it in your own accent. The flood story's core motifs are sticky. A divine decision, a warning, a vessel, the preservation of life, a storm that erases normal boundaries, a landing, birds, an offering, a post-flood adjustment to prevent repetition. These elements are memorable and reusable, which makes them perfect for diffusion. If one city has a compelling flood narrative, neighboring cities can adopt it, tweak it, retell it, and soon it feels like it always belonged there. You imagine a scribe hearing a flood account from another region and thinking, "That's good. That's worth copying." Then they adapt it to their own theological preferences. Maybe they elevate their city's favored deity. Maybe they change the hero's name to fit local tradition. Maybe they keep the structure but shift the motive, turning cosmic decree into noise complaint, or turning population management into a lesson about mortality. The story travels, but it doesn't arrive unchanged. It arrives wearing local clothing. Now you consider the other possibility: parallel development. Floods happen, people fear them, people survive them, people tell stories about them. Some narrative choices are just obvious. If you're trapped on a boat and you want to know if land exists, you send something out. A bird makes sense. If your world is dominated by rivers, a flood as world reset makes sense. If your society depends on managed water, uncontrolled water feels like cosmic chaos. You don't have to borrow those ideas. You can generate them from experience. And this is where your open, scholarly debate phrase fits perfectly. Because the question refuses to be neat. Historians still argue whether the close similarities among Mesopotamian flood narratives are best explained by direct textual transmission and adaptation between Sumerian and Akkadian literary traditions, or whether many shared motifs arise naturally from common environmental conditions and shared myth-making patterns that could develop in parallel even without one-to-one borrowing. You can feel both forces operating at once. Like two hands shaping the same clay from different sides. You keep your comparison calm by noticing what looks like fingerprints of borrowing versus what looks like universal myth logic. Fingerprints of borrowing might include specific sequences that match closely, like the ordered release of birds, or the particular way a god uses a loophole to warn the human without technically breaking an oath. That reed wall trick feels like a distinctive narrative solution, the sort of thing that can be copied because it's clever and satisfying. It's also funny in a sleepy way, which is joke number 2. The gods here are cosmic, terrifying, and still absolutely obsessed with technicalities. "I didn't warn him, Your Honor. I warned the wall." Divine lawyering at its finest. Universal myth logic might include the general notion that disaster comes from divine displeasure, or that survival requires preparation, or that an offering is needed to restore relationship afterward. Those patterns appear in many cultures because they reflect human attempts to negotiate uncertainty. When you can't control the river, you control your response. You tell a story where response matters. You also notice that borrowing in Mesopotamia can happen in more than one direction and more than one way. A story can move orally through travelers, then later be written down, or a written composition can be copied in schools and spread as a set text. Or a poet can blend multiple older traditions into a new, more polished work. It's not a single pipeline. It's a messy ecosystem, and the ecosystem includes power. When an empire grows, it doesn't just move armies, it moves scribes, administrators, and literary tastes. A story favored in one court can become fashionable elsewhere. A text copied in one library can be captured, transported, recopied. Even captivity can become a channel. Grim as that is, because people carry their stories with them. You can sense how the flood narrative, once prestigious, becomes part of a shared cultural repertoire. Not because everyone agrees on theology, but because everyone recognizes a good story that explains why life is bounded and why water is scary. Now your quirky tidbit arrives. Quiet and a little nerdy, like a strange candy you don't expect to enjoy. Some flood motifs may have traveled not only as stories, but as set phrases and literary building blocks. Scribes learn formulas, repeated lines, stock images, and traditional ways of describing storms, divine counsels, and ritual offerings. Those formulas can migrate between works. So sometimes what spreads is not a whole narrative but a toolkit of poetic parts. A later author can assemble the parts into a new arrangement, and it feels familiar even if it isn't copied, line by line. It's like having a shared set of Lego pieces across different boxes. You keep walking and think about how names change too, because names are another clue. Zeus Sudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim. Different heroes, similar roles. That can mean different local traditions. Each had a wise survivor figure who later got aligned with the flood motif. Or it can mean one tradition's hero got renamed as the story moved and merged into other literary contexts. It can also mean scribes enjoyed reassigning the role to different legendary figures for different narrative needs. In Gilgamesh, the flood survivor needs to be someone who can talk about immortality in a personal way. So Utnapishtim becomes that person. Even if the flood story's bones echo Atrahasis, you notice, too, that influence does not require a single origin point. Think of it like a river delta. Multiple channels feed the same sea. A Sumerian flood narrative can influence Akkadian ones. Yes, but Akkadian revisions can also influence later reworkings in the way scribes understand and teach the Sumerian past. Influence can loop back. The story can be old and still be reshaped by the newer forms that become more popular. The past is not only behind you. In literature, it gets edited by the present. Here is your third light joke. Soft as a yawn. You imagine two scribes arguing about which version is the real one, and a third scribe just points at the clay and says, "Real is the one you can still read." It's a brutally practical idea. But in a world of broken tablets and lost libraries, preservation is its own kind of authority. You keep the calm, because this question of borrowing versus parallel development is not meant to be solved like a puzzle. It's meant to show you how stories behave. They move like water, They follow channels. They pick up sediment. They carve new paths. They spread because they fit the landscape of human concern. And you begin to feel the bigger point, even if there was direct borrowing. It doesn't reduce the stories to copies. Adaptation is a creative act. Each community, each scribe, each poet who shapes the flood narrative is responding to real conditions. Rivers that flood, cities that depend on water, gods that reflect how power feels from below, mortality that haunts kings and farmers alike. As you walk toward the next current, you sense a small shift in mood. You've stayed mostly in mainstream terrain, weighing influence and environment. Now, ahead, the water gets a little weirder. Not in a scary way, but in the people love a good theory way. Because once you have a flood story that is ancient, famous, and full of cosmic scale, it becomes a magnet for fringe currents, planets, poles, secret histories, and all the rumors that drift through the night like moths around a porch light. You keep walking and you feel the air shift into that part of the night where your thoughts get a little floaty. Like your brain is a boat too, gently unmoored. This is where the flood story attracts its fringe currents. Not because the mainstream explanations aren't interesting, but because humans love mystery the way moths love porch lights. If something is ancient, enormous, and half fragmentary, people will lean in and whisper, "What if there's more?" And sure, there might be more in the sense that any old story has layers. But more in fringe territory often means more dramatic. And tonight, you're doing the no-drama version. So you glance at the weird theories. You acknowledge why they're tempting, and then you set them back on the shelf like a book you don't need to finish to fall asleep. This is your mainstream historical fact for the section, placed calmly right up front, like a grounding hand on the shoulder. Ancient Mesopotamian flood narratives survive in multiple textual traditions, copied and edited over long periods. And scholars study them using philology, archaeology, and comparative literature rather than treating them as straightforward eyewitness records of global cataclysm. That doesn't mean the stories are fake. It means they're doing a different kind of work, meaning-making. Now you let the fringe river flow past you in a controlled channel. One common fringe current claims the flood story is a literal memory of a single worldwide ocean event, sometimes tied to an external trigger like a comet impact or a sudden shift in Earth poles. The appeal is obvious. It makes the myth feel like a warning label. It makes you feel like you're holding secret knowledge the textbooks ignore. And it gives the human mind what it craves. One cause, one event, one grand explanation. But the calmer view is that Mesopotamia already provides plenty of flood potential through its river systems, its flat alluvial plains, and its dependence on fragile water management. A huge flood can be locally total. It doesn't need to be planetary to feel like everything. Another fringe stream tries to connect the flood myth to a lost, advanced civilization. The idea that before the flood there was some high-tech world and the survivor carries its knowledge forward. You can see how this plugs into the reset logic. If the world is wiped clean, then anything could have existed before. It becomes a blank canvas for imagination. But the Mesopotamian texts that talk about antediluvian times are often doing mythic scale, not technological cataloging. They stretch the past to make it feel vast, not to smuggle in secret machines. The stories remember kings, not robots. They remember divine councils, not circuit boards. They remember the fragility of order, not the blueprints of an airport. Here comes your first light joke, because the fringe shelf can handle it if there was a super-advanced civilization before the flood. You're telling me they didn't invent waterproof storage for their tablets? That is either tragic or proof they were not as advanced as they think. Ancient people at least used clay, which is basically the closest thing to a backup drive you can bake in a fire. Now, you let the most famous fringe current glide by, because it always shows up sooner or later, the Anunnaki as aliens angle, where divine beings become extraterrestrials, and myths become misunderstood descriptions of spacecraft, genetic engineering, and off-world agendas. It's a theory that has cultural staying power because it turns gods into something your modern brain can picture in sci-fi terms. It also keeps the mystery alive. But the calmer reading is that Mesopotamian gods behave like gods in a human society. They argue, they negotiate, they demand offerings, they mess up, they regret, they enforce order. If you turn them into aliens, you've just swapped one unknown for another. You haven't actually explained the myth. You've changed the costume, and now your open, scholarly debate phrase arrives. Because even the presence of fringe theories tells you something worth keeping, historians still argue whether the enduring popularity of cataclysm and secret knowledge interpretations reflects gaps in public understanding of how ancient texts are preserved and translated, or whether it reflects a genuine human psychological need to make large, frightening stories feel purposeful, solvable, and connected to a single dramatic cause. That debate isn't about proving aliens. It's about understanding why humans keep wanting aliens. You glance at a subtler fringe current, astronomical decoding. Some people map flood motifs to the sky, treating bird sequences, mountain landings, and divine symbols as star charts or cyclical calendar markers. And yes, ancient Mesopotamians watched the sky closely. They tracked celestial movements. They connected patterns in heaven to patterns on earth. But the calmer approach is that the flood narratives, as they survive in literature, don't need secret star codes to make sense. The bird test works fine as a practical environmental check. The mountain works fine as a symbol of refuge. Sometimes a raven is just a raven doing raven things, which includes being rude and refusing to report back. That's joke number 2. By the way, you imagine the raven in the Gilgamesh account like an unpaid intern who finally sees land and decides, I quit, and never returns. Honestly, mood. You also encounter fringe readings that insist every detail must correspond to a literal historical event, down to boat dimensions and precise day counts. The urge here is certainty. If the numbers are exact, then the story must be factual. But literature can use numbers symbolically and rhythmically. 7 days, for instance, can signal completeness or intensity rather than a stopwatch measurement. A boat's proportions can signal order, containment, and wholeness rather than a shipwright's blueprint. The text can be detailed and still be mythic. Detail is not the same thing as journalism. Now you feel the calm payoff of seeing fringe currents without being swept away. The flood story doesn't need added drama to be meaningful. It already contains a huge idea, one that is emotionally true, even if it is not a single event you can put on a calendar. The world you rely on can break, and you will still have to rebuild. That's the real terror and the real comfort. And it's plenty. Your quirky tidbit for this section is actually a gentle reminder about how modern culture shapes interpretation. Many fringe flood theories gain traction because they travel through modern media that rewards suspense, certainty, and big reveals. Scholars are still debating complex textual layers is not as clickable as ancient tablet proves global cataclysm. That doesn't mean curiosity is bad. It means the format pushes the story toward drama. Tonight, you're doing the opposite. You're letting the complexity be soft and breathable. You take one more look at the shelf of fringe ideas and you don't sneer at it. You don't need to. The people who love these theories are often responding to the same thing you are. the uncanny feeling that these flood stories are old, powerful, and a little too familiar. The difference is that you're choosing to sit with the familiarity instead of turning it into a chase scene. Your third light joke arrives softly as you turn away. You imagine an ancient scribe watching modern debates and thinking, I wrote this so my student would learn signs. And now you're arguing about planetary pole shifts. The scribe would probably just go back to correcting handwriting. And now the current carries you back towards something calmer and more central. Why this story lasts? Not because it hides a secret, but because it organizes fear into a shape you can hold. Because it lets you imagine survival inside catastrophe. Because it gives you a language for limits and renewal. The next stretch of river is about endurance. About why people keep retelling this even when the water has long since receded. You keep walking, and the fringe shelf fades behind you like a room you've left without slamming the door. The river is still here. Steady. Indifferent. And that steadiness helps you feel the real question. Why does the flood story last so long? Not just survive in clay and ink, but persist in the human mind. Why does it keep getting retold, copied, adapted, tucked into epics, whispered in temples, and revived in modern conversations when people are trying to make sense of their own storms? The answer is not one dramatic secret. It's a handful of quiet functions the story performs again and again. Like a tool you keep reaching for because it still fits your hand. You slow down and let the patterns you've been collecting settle into place. First, the flood story is a way of making chaos feel legible. Uncontrolled water is formless. It blurs boundaries, erases roads, levels houses, and turns an organized city into a brown sheet. But a story gives the flood a beginning, middle, and end. It gives it causes, agents, steps, and consequences. Even if the cause is something absurdly human, like you were too loud, it's still a cause. It's still the brain saying, this did not happen for no reason. That impulse alone is a kind of comfort, even if the comfort is questionable. This is your mainstream historical fact for the section, set down gently like a warm stone. Mesopotamian literature often explores themes of order versus chaos, divine human reciprocity, and the fragility of civilization in a landscape shaped by powerful rivers. Flood narratives fit naturally into that worldview because they dramatize the stakes of maintaining order in a place where order is never guaranteed. Second, the flood story preserves a survival ethic. It teaches you to pay attention and prepare. In every telling, the survivor is not saved by luck alone. He listens, he builds, he seals, he organizes, he endures, he offers, he negotiates. Whether he is Ziusudra, the ritual-aligned king, Atrahasis, the wise negotiator, or Utnapishtim, the careful builder who becomes an immortal exception, the message is similar. Survival is an action, not a vibe, which is honestly rude to everyone who prefers survival as a vibe, including you. Because you would absolutely like to just manifest safety and call it a day. That's joke number one. Quiet and affectionate. You can't manifest a watertight hull. You have to smear the bitumen. Sorry. Third, the flood story explains limits. This is a huge reason it lasts. And it's not dramatic. It's existential. Mesopotamian flood narratives help explain why humans are mortal, why suffering exists, why the world is not stable, and why gods can be unpredictable. In Atrahasis, the post-flood measures introduce structural limits on human population. In Gilgamesh, the flood story becomes a wall. Gilgamesh cannot climb. Immortality was granted once, not to be repeated. In Ziusudra, survival is linked to divine favor and special status, implying that ordinary life remains bounded. Across the family, the flood marks a transition from a mythic before to a constrained after. It is a narrative way of saying, there are rules now, and you live inside them. And this is where your open scholarly debate phrase fits naturally, because it's the kind of question scholars and storytellers both keep circling. Historians still argue whether flood narratives endure primarily because they preserve cultural memory of environmental vulnerability, or because they serve as adaptable philosophical frameworks that can be repurposed to address shifting social anxieties, from kingship and labor to mortality and moral order. Again, you don't have to choose one. A story can remember rivers and also remember feelings. Fourth, the flood story is a social glue. It's shared. It can be recited. It can be referenced in conversation like a shorthand for things can fall apart. When everyone knows the motifs, you can allude to them, like the birds after the storm, like the boat sealed with pitch, like the gods arguing. It becomes a common language for vulnerability and rebuilding. In a society held together by irrigation cooperation and temple calendars, shared stories aren't just entertainment, they're coordination, identity, and a sense that you're part of something bigger than your own courtyard. Fifth, the flood story offers a controlled experience of fear. This matters more than people admit. In real life, floods are unpredictable and terrifying. In story form, you can approach the terror safely. You can experience the storm through a narrative hull that contains it. You can feel dread and then feel resolution. The story has an ending, and that ending is often the waters recede, the land returns, the offering is made, life restarts. That arc is soothing. It doesn't deny catastrophe. It puts catastrophe in a frame. Here's joke number 2. Soft and true. It's basically the ancient version of watching a disaster movie while sitting on a couch with snacks. Except your snacks are barley bread and your couch is a reed mat. And your neighbor is telling you the gods are mad because you laughed too loudly at the donkey. But you get the idea. Fair. Contained. You let the river's sound emphasize the final big reason. The flood story is an engine for meaning in a world where the environment is both provider and threat. The Tigris and Euphrates make agriculture possible. They also make disaster inevitable. That duality is baked into Mesopotamian life. A flood narrative is not an outlier. It is a concentrated expression of what it feels like to live in that landscape. It says, we build anyway. We return anyway. We accept risk because the river is life. Now, your quirky tidbit for this section. Gentle and human. Flood stories often gain strength because they allow retelling at different levels. A child can hear it as a big flood and a boat. A scribe can hear it as a literary masterpiece with inherited motifs. A priest can hear it as a lesson in reciprocity and ritual. A king can hear it as a reminder that order is fragile and leadership matters. A tired farmer can hear it as a grim nod to how water can ruin a year's work in a day. The same story meets different listeners where they are. That adaptability is why it lives. You notice how this also explains the story's calmness in some versions. Not every retelling needs to shock. Some retellings are meant to steady. The no-drama approach is actually ancient too. Formal recitation, measured detail, ritual tone, all of that can keep catastrophe from overwhelming the listener. It lets you look at disaster without flinching. It turns panic into pattern. Your third light joke arrives right at the edge of sleepiness. You imagine the flood story as the oldest don't ignore maintenance. PSA. Keep the canals clean. Keep the levees strong. Keep the offerings regular. And maybe, just maybe, don't yell at your donkey at midnight if the gods are trying to nap. It's myth, but it's also community management. As you continue walking, You feel that you're nearing the quiet confluence where all these versions meet. You've compared motives, craft, proof, aftermath, scribal transmission, real floods, borrowing, and fringe currents. Now you're ready to let the stories sit together without forcing them into one, like rivers meeting in the dark, carrying different sediments, still distinct for a while, then slowly blending into a single, wide flow. And in that wide flow, you can sense the final section approaching, where you bring the family of flood narratives into one calm, nighttime view. Let their differences remain and drift toward rest. You arrive at the confluence without fanfare, the way rivers do when they stop pretending they are separate. The Tigris and Euphrates are not literally meeting under your feet in this moment, but the feeling is the same. Currents slide together, carrying different colors of silt, and for a while you can still see the boundaries, the faint lines where one stream keeps its identity. That is what these flood stories feel like now. Ziusudra's quiet ritual steadiness, Atrahasis's divine noise complaint and policy rewrite, Utnapishtim's measured boat-building memory spoken inside Gilgamesh's aching search for meaning. 3 channels, one wide river of human attention. You stand on the bank and let yourself hold them all at once, without forcing them into a single, correct version. The calm comparison is not indecision. It's respect for how ancient storytelling works. The people who wrote and copied these narratives did not always iron out contradictions because contradictions can be useful. One contradiction says the gods are strict, and another says the gods are regretting their own excess, and another says the gods are basically tired administrators who need better sleep. All of that can be true in a mythic world that is meant to mirror human experience. The quietest thing you notice is how each version answers the same question differently. What does it mean to keep living when the world proves it can break? Ziusudra's answer is alignment. Listen correctly. Perform the right acts. Survival is tied to legitimacy, to sacred attention, to being the kind of person the cosmos can keep. Atrahasis's answer is negotiation and clever endurance. Appeal to the right powers. Find the loophole. Survive, and then accept limits because the system will change you whether you like it or not. Utnapishtim's answer, delivered through the Epic of Gilgamesh, is both practical and bitterly philosophical. Build the boat. Make the offering. But do not mistake survival for a doorway to immortality you can walk through whenever you feel like it. Immortality is an exception, and the exception itself becomes a warning. This is your mainstream historical fact for the section, set down gently like a final stone in a path. Mesopotamian flood accounts survive as related but distinct compositions across Sumerian and Akkadian traditions. And the best-known flood narrative comes to many readers through the Epic of Gilgamesh, where it functions as a reflective memory inside a larger story about kingship and mortality. That context matters because it changes what the flood is. For it's not only disaster, it's instruction, identity, and a mirror. You let your mind return to the craft details, because craft is where myth touches the hand. Reed bundles, wooden frames, thick pitch ceiling seams, compartments making order inside chaos. Those details keep repeating because they are comforting in a world where rivers are unpredictable. The boat is a human answer to water's arrogance. And the birds, those small scouts released into bright air, keep repeating because they are the gentlest kind of proof. Not grand prophecy, not thunder, just a dove returning, a swallow returning, and a raven deciding it has better plans. Here's your first light joke. Soft and sleepy. You imagine yourself on that boat with your modern habits, trying to refresh the horizon every 5 minutes like it's a web page. Still water, still water, still water. Then the raven never comes back and you're like, finally, the notification I needed. Except it's the end of the world, so maybe don't celebrate too loudly. You think about the post-flood moment. The smoke rising, the gods gathering, the argument in the divine council, the quiet policy changes that explain why life remains bounded. That aftermath is one of the deepest common threads across these traditions. The flood is not the final statement. The final statement is what comes after. Restraint, limits, renewed reciprocity. Even when the gods look embarrassing, clustering around an offering as if they forgot they were divine. The story is doing something important. It is showing interdependence. Humans need stability. Gods, in these texts, need worship and offerings and the continuation of the system. The flood threatens both sides, and the post-flood negotiation repairs both sides. Now your open scholarly debate phrase settles in, calm as a hand on a blanket. Historians still argue whether the Mesopotamian flood tradition should be read primarily as a cultural memory shaped by real river disasters and their social consequences, or as a deliberately constructed literary framework that different communities use to explore power, responsibility, and human limits across changing political eras. You can feel how those two readings meet. Real mud and real fear become story. Story becomes a tool for thinking. The tool gets reused. You allow one quirky tidbit to drift through, not as a takeover, just as a reminder that these stories can be interpreted in many registers. Some modern fringe currents insist the flood must encode a single hidden event, a global cataclysm with one precise cause. And they treat every measurement and motif like a cipher. The calmer thought is that the cipher is often the human heart itself. The flood encodes what it feels like when your world becomes unrecognizable overnight, and you have to accept help, accept limits, and begin again. That's not less interesting than secret cataclysms. It's more applicable, and it doesn't require you to pretend a raven is a star map. Here's your second light joke, because you deserve another small smile. If the gods truly flood the world because humans are noisy, then honestly, the invention of snoring should have gotten someone smited immediately. Ancient people, modern people, all of us, just trying to sleep while other humans make impossible sounds. You watch the stories blend one last time, and you notice the gentle lesson hiding in the no-drama approach. The most frightening part of floods is not only their violence, it's their patience. Water rises when you're not looking. Water finds weak spots. Water erases boundaries without needing to roar. These ancient narratives capture that, and then they answer it with a slow counter-movement. Preparation, endurance, and rebuilding. The stories do not promise you safety forever. They promise you that rebuilding is possible, and that the world can return, even if it returns with new rules. And the final comfort, the one you can hold without gripping too hard, is that these stories survived in clay precisely because people kept choosing continuity. Scribes copied, teachers corrected, students struggled, libraries collected. Empires shifted languages. The flood story remained useful, not because it was the loudest, but because it was steady. It could be retold at a hearth, recited in a temple, studied in a school, and embedded in an epic without losing its bones. Here's your third light joke. Very quiet, you imagine a tired scribe, eyes gritty with clay dust, thinking, if I have to write bitumen one more time, I'm joining the flood. And then they write it anyway. Because continuity is what humans do when they're stubborn enough. You stand at the confluence, and you let the three currents keep their differences as they flow onward into the dark. You don't need to pick one. You only need to feel how they carry the same basic truth. The world can flood, and you can still begin again. Slowly, carefully, with smoke rising into a calmer sky. The night settles around you like a soft cloth. The river's sound becomes less like a lesson and more like a lullaby, a steady hush that doesn't demand anything from you now. You picture the boat again, not as panic, but as shelter, sealed seams, quiet compartments, the small patience of waiting while the storm spends itself. You picture the birds, too, their wings cutting through cool air, and you let their simple logic soothe you. Not yet, not yet. And then, yes, you don't have to solve every contradiction. You don't have to decide which god was most annoyed, or which mountain was most accurate, or whether the storm lasted exactly this many days. You only have to notice what the stories keep offering you, over and over, in a calm voice. Prepare what you can. Accept what you can't control. When the water recedes, take one careful step onto the new ground. You imagine the first thin thread of smoke rising after the flood, and you let it drift upward and fade, not into drama, but into quiet reassurance. Life continues. People rebuild. Words get copied. The river returns to its channel, and even if it wanders again someday, tonight it is steady. Tonight it is only sound. Your eyes grow heavy. The fan hum becomes a distant companion, like reeds whispering along a bank. The ancient cities soften in your mind, their bricks warm, their lamps low. The flood, which once felt enormous, now feels like a story held at a safe distance. A reminder that endings can turn into beginnings without needing to shout. You breathe in slow, and you breathe out slow, and you let the last image be gentle. A wide river under starlight, carrying many currents together, moving forward without hurry, as if it knows you're ready to sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.